Imagine you have a barrel full of salt pork. How will you prepare it? In today's episode, we'll be doing a Cheshire pork pie for the sea. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. If you haven't seen our recent salt pork episode, make sure to go back and watch that. It sets the stage for this episode. Now, this recipe is called a Cheshire pork pie for the sea. It's from The Art of Cookery. This is Hannah Glass's cookbook. It is the most popular English cookbook of the 18th century. So it's very, very common that people would recognize this and know this in our time period. Now, here's the recipe as it's written. Take some salt pork that has been boiled, cut it into thin slices, and an equal quantity of potatoes pared and sliced thin. Make a good crust, cover the dish, lay a layer of meat, seasoned with a little pepper, a layer of potatoes, and a layer of meat, and a layer of potatoes, so on until your pie is full. Season it with pepper. When it is full, lay some butter on the top. Fill your dish about half full of soft water, close your pie up, and bake it in a gentle oven. Seems pretty simple. It is a very simple pie with just meat, potatoes, a little bit of spices, tiny bit of butter and water, seal it up, and you bake it. And you're probably thinking, okay, now why is this a pie for the sea, right? And that's part of the story about them using salt pork here. Salt pork is a way to preserve pork. It's the kind of thing that if you didn't have anything fresh, maybe you're all the way in the spring, you need food, you're going to have salt pork stored back. If you're at sea, salt pork is one of the few meats you'll have available to you all the time. Salt beef, salt pork. So that's why they're talking about it being at sea. This is the kind of food that sailors, even the officers on board ship, are going to have to use this at times. Now, we might think of this as a kind of a rich pie with lots of meat in it. It's probably actually a very inexpensive pie for the time period. So even poor people would be able to make a pie like this because it's salt pork, because it's potatoes, and basically nothing else. Here's the problem, and kind of a interesting take on this particular recipe, that sailors on board a ship, they were just given boiled salt pork. They just got this kind of boiled pork on a plate, and good luck with that. If an officer on board ship, if their supplies had run out, the kind that they brought on board for themselves, livestock and whatnot, when all those things ran out, it was time to use the regular provisions that just regular sailors would have, but they wouldn't want to eat it like the other sailors would have it. So the captain on board ship would say, well, fix up that salt pork, but make sure it doesn't look like just common salt pork. So they would cook it up into a pie like this. So this might very well show up on the captain's table for him to eat, maybe with his guests. The same fare as anybody else is getting, but made in a kind of a special way. So this is a great fun recipe and a great way to use salt pork rather than just boiling it. Let's start to prepare this recipe, and we're going to do it in the order that she kind of calls for it. We've got boiled salt pork here, and this salt pork, the boiling process is very, very simple. There are directions for boiling salt pork in Hannah Glass, so you can follow those directions, but really the trick with any salt meat like this is you put it into the water when the water's cold and you bring it up to boiling. For fresh meat, you put it in the boiling water. But this has been boiled about 45 minutes or so. The pieces aren't too big. And we're just gonna cut it into our thin slices. Now I do wanna check to see whether or not it's too salty. And boy, it's gonna be good. It's not too salty. So you may not have a giant full barrel of salt pork, but you still want to experience this recipe. And that that situation happened in the 18th century, and so they had a sort of a speed method for salt preparation. If you want to have salt pork, use it for a recipe like this, but you don't have salt pork, all you have to do is take your pork pieces and put them in salt, dry salt, for maybe 24 hours or so ahead of time, and then wipe that salt off and you can use it. It's going to give you almost exactly the same sort of flavor. It's going to be not quite as tough as salt pork would be because the salt pulls all the moisture out. Even when it's like submerged, it still pulls all the moisture out, makes the meat a little firmer, but it definitely gives it a little bit different flavor also. So there were situations in the 18th century where they had recipes. It's like, oh, you want to make a quick salt pork? Well, this is how you do it. The meat has been pre-cooked, but the potatoes are not. I've already peeled these up with my knife. I am gonna make sure these are thin slices so that they cook all the way through in the pie. She calls for a good pie crust. So we're making up just the standard short paste with flour, butter, tiny bit of salt, the flour and the butter in a 3-to-1 ratio. Very, very simple and easy to do pie crust. Something you should definitely do at home. Don't buy your pie crusts. You need to make them. Our pie is all assembled. It's ready to go into the oven, and she calls for it to be baked in a gentle oven. So this is likely about 350 degrees. Now we're going to be using our giant clay oven for this, and that's a little bit trickier. So I'm going to aim for about 400 degrees, put it in there, probably bake it, I don't know, I'm guessing 45 minutes, and the temperature will slowly go down. If you're doing it in a regular home oven, yeah, 350 degrees should sound good, and well, we'll just see how long it takes. So let's get it in the oven. Wow, this pie smells great. And it came out of the oven, it looks good. And I cut into this and the steam came out and everything, and just, I can't wait. I cannot wait to try this out. It looks so good. Let's try a piece of the pork all by itself. Turned out perfect. I was worried it was going to be too salty because it's salt pork. There's a real reason why we have all these potatoes in here. That dilutes the saltiness out of this so that it's not, kind of too salty. And really, it turned out just right. And all that pepper in there, again, balances it. Now, the original recipe may have had all that pepper in there to sort of offset maybe bad salt pork that has been in the barrel too long. But in this case, it's really good. Love that peppery flavor in there. We didn't need to add any salt, and it doesn't need any other spices. I mean, you could go crazy and add nutmeg to this, but you don't need to. It's really good just like this, and so incredibly simple. I mean, it's just got the salt pork, it's got the potatoes, a little bit of butter, and the pie crust, and it's a great combination. So I'm really liking how this one turned out. It's going to be one of my favorites, definitely, for this year. It's great to think about a recipe like this. It seems in the cookbook that it's so simple. There's really nothing to it. But when you understand the connections, the connection between the idea of using the salt pork and it being a Cheshire pork pie for the sea, and the reasons why you would do this, now it starts to make all kinds of sense. In context, it's a very important recipe. So I really like this one and suggest it to a lot of different people. And of course, it's in Hannah Glass's cookbook. So if you're interested in that, you can check out our website. We sell that cookbook, and it is one of the best for understanding what's going on with English cookery of the 18th century. We live in a day and age of rapidly rising food prices. It's something that affects basically everyone. In fact, it seems like all around the world, that's a problem right now. That certainly was a problem in the 18th and 19th century also. So how did they deal with it? And what was going on in the 18th and 19th century? Well, in Great Britain during that time period, they had several different kinds of crop failures and other economic upheaval. Basically the same thing happening in the 18th century and in the early 19th century is basically happening today. A lot of similar kinds of situations. And rapidly rising food prices, who do they hit the worst? The working families, right? That's the people who are always on the edge, and food is the major part of the budget. And today, actually, it's much easier than it was in the 18th century. In the 18th century, the food budget is a percentage of the amount of money they had to spend, which was much higher. So maybe half their money or more was spent on food. And when food prices go up, it's very, very difficult. So there are some things that they could do. And there are people that were thinking about it, working on that problem in the 18th century. Primitive cookery doesn't really have a particular author here that we know of. It's really a collection of recipes that for the most part are vegetarian, because the author here knows that meat in that time period is very expensive. So what other kinds of recipes can we have? So he's collected a lot of current recipes, put them together in this cookbook. Also in the back, there's a menu or a bill of fare of 70 dishes that cost less than 2 pence per serving. So in today's money, maybe $2 or $3. A very, very inexpensive meal. And some of them are interesting, some of them are kind of funny. Bread and butter and a glass of water make a good meal. Well, okay, it can. If you're a very poor person, maybe that's just exactly what you can afford. And so some of these might seem very, very simple, but very obvious and very good. And we've just touched on that idea of a printer's meal in the Benjamin Franklin series, where he talks about beer and bread and cheese. That's breakfast, right? So some of these are very, very simple, boiling eggs or, having them on toast. I thought this one in the back, though, quite interesting, and one that we would cook today. And there are several different dumplings in here, and dumplings in this time period could be sort of like a boiled pudding, where you put a batter into a bag and you boil it, or you can just drop these things right into the water. And that's what we're going to be making today. It says dumplings boiled with flour, milk, and water, only with a little ginger and yeast when it is boiled. You butter it, and it is an excellent food. Isn't that interesting that if we don't have meat and we don't even have bread, maybe all we have here is a little bit of flour, and we want to spice that up. Just flour is really boring. And so what do we put in here? We put ginger in. Ginger, one of the least expensive spices in the time period, and would also show up in things like pancakes. So it isn't odd that this kind of spice would show up in this particular thing. But these are also suggestions. I think today when we look at cookbooks, we don't think about the recipe as a suggestion, saying, well, you could do this or change it up, change this specifically. And in this case, I'm sure that maybe you wouldn't need, if you didn't have ginger, but you had something else you wanted to make it spicy, well, you could use cayenne pepper. You could use just plain pepper, some other things to make it something more than just intensely bland. So we're going to make these very, very simple dumplings, and they're talked about in many different kinds of cookbooks. Usually they're cooked in with something else, but in this case, they're done all by themselves. So we've got some flour, probably about 1.5 cups. We're going to add a little bit of salt. Salt isn't mentioned directly in this recipe, but we want a little bit of savory in these, so we're going to add a little bit of salt. And now we're going to add the flavor. And the flavor resides just in this ginger. And I'm going to use a good little bit of ginger here. If your ginger is old and has taken a while to get to you, especially in the 18th century, it might have taken a long way to get to you. It might be a little weak. So we're going to use a nice little bit of ginger. And then this also has yeast in it. Some of these dumplings didn't have yeast. They would be hard dumplings. And that's good. They're fun. They almost have a meaty flavor to them, or a consistency. They're so sort of tough to cut into. They wanted this one to be a little bit fluffier. So we're going to add a little bit of yeast. Yeast in the time period would have been a liquid yeast that came from the brewer. That's also probably going to bring some flavor into it from the 18th century. It's going to have a little bit of hops. It's going to have a little bit of bitter to it. Our yeast doesn't have anything like that. That's why we have so much ginger in here. We're going to mix these up with a little bit more water, depending on how much water came in with our yeast. And I'm going to set these beside the fire for just a few minutes, a half hour, just to give that yeast time to wake up, perk up a little bit. It might rise a tiny bit. I don't expect it to, but when it goes into the boiling water, it will start to spring up a little bit. There we go. It's our meal for 2 pence. Wonderful dumplings with a spicy ginger flavor. Got our butter melting in here. There's one of our dumplings. These, depending on how hot the water boils, or how hard the water is boiling, they may take a little bit longer or less. I don't like to have the water boiling too much when you put these in, or it breaks them apart. So you kind of put it in before the water boils, and then you kind of let them half cook, and then the water boils a little bit. Even though I put a good amount of ginger in there, it's just sitting there as a flavor. It isn't overwhelming at all. It definitely needed the salt, and of course the butter pushes it right up over the top. Hopefully you've got butter to put in your dumplings, but they are so massively inexpensive, really. I mean, you can see how this could be part of a larger meal, and it could be just, if you were boiling meat, you would toss these in at the same time. If you couldn't afford the meat, this is what you had. You might even, if you were really that hard up, you'd save that water that you boiled these in. There's still a little bit of that flour in that water, and it serves as possibly a very, very inexpensive morning drink if you didn't want to throw anything out, and in some cases that's exactly what's happening. So it's been a generation since we've seen these rapidly increasing food prices. But we've seen it before, haven't we? Maybe 100 years ago. And we certainly see it in the beginning of the 19th century, the 1800s. We see it in the 1700s. Food prices going up, and of course, all this hardship. But we study history, and you've heard you study history so you don't repeat it, where you don't want to be doomed to repeat it. But we also study history so that we know what people went through and what they lived through We're here because they lived through those difficult times. Sometimes those difficult times helped them as time moved forward. Sometimes you have to have difficult times so you know what the good times are like. So yeah, we really need to study history. We really need to look back into cookbooks 250 years old that tell us what people were eating at that time when they didn't have enough money to put meat on the table. Yeah, I love being able to dig into these things, try these things out, experience what they were experiencing, even if it's just a little bit. Thanks for coming along with us today as we experience these things, as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. "1771, the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. My companion at the press drank every day a pint of beer before breakfast, a pint of beer at breakfast with his bread and cheese, a pint between breakfast and dinner, a pint at dinner, a pint in the afternoon after 6 o'clock, and another when he was done with his day's work." When we think of breakfast today, I'm not sure that many of us are thinking about beer, bread, and cheese to start the day off, right? Where we have something like cereal with milk, or maybe we have a donut and coffee, or a big breakfast, eggs, bacon, hash browns. A breakfast for a workman, maybe somebody working in the city here in a print shop in the 18th century. What was his breakfast every day? A pint of beer, loaf of bread, and cheese. This was a very common kind of thing to eat in the 18th century. Sometimes we think about people drinking beer in the 18th century and we think they're drinking it because the water isn't safe. I don't think that is necessarily true in this case. They're drinking beer for breakfast and beer all day long because they like it, because they think that's what they ought to be drinking. There are even circumstances here when we read deeper into this section where they think beer makes them strong. In fact, strong beer makes them strong. They had different kinds of beer in the 18th century. They had small beer, which would be very low alcohol. That was drunk by everyone, children and women alike. They had the normal beer, and then they had strong beer that had more alcoholic content. And they thought strong beer made strong men. So let me set the stage for exactly where Benjamin Franklin is when he's writing this. He's in London, he's working at a print house. He's probably about 20 years old. And here he goes. He says, "At my first admission into this printing house, I took to working at press, imagining I felt a want of bodily exercise that I'd been used to in America, where press work is mixed with composing. I drank only water. The other workmen, near 50 in number, were great guzzlers of beer. On occasion, I carried up and down stairs a large form of types in each hand, when others could carry but one in both hands. They wondered to see from this and other several instances that the water American, as they called me, was stronger than themselves, who drank strong beer. They had an alehouse boy who attended always in the house to supply the workmen. And my companion at press drank every day a pint before breakfast, a pint at breakfast with his cheese and bread, a pint between breakfast and dinner, a pint at dinner, a pint afternoon, about 6 o'clock, and another when he was done with his day's work. I thought it a detestable custom, but it was necessary, he supposed, to drink strong beer, that he might be strong to labor." Benjamin Franklin tries to convince these men that the amount of money that they're spending on drinking beer all day long, 3/4 of a gallon a day, could be better spent in other ways, and that they were spending a lot, almost a third of their income on their beer every day, that there was a better way. I don't think any of them were convinced. They continued to drink their beer while the very frugal, let's call, Benjamin Franklin continued to drink his water. This workman's breakfast that we're talking about of beer, bread, and cheese got me thinking about Primitive Cookery, which was a cookbook that was meant for workmen in the city, how they could eat less expensively. And listed in the back are 70 meals that would be very, very inexpensive. And here's number 4, bread and butter and a glass of fair water or a pint of ale make a good meal. And here's number 5. Bread and cheese does the same, and a pint of water or ale, and salads eaten with either, only washed without oil, salt, or vinegar, they make wholesome food. Maybe number 6, water gruel, seasoned with salt only, and eaten with bread and butter. By biting and supping in this excellent food, it breeds good blood and causes it to circulate freely. So let's try out this workman's breakfast. What's it gonna be like? Yes, I've been working at my press, and the press work is hard work. He's turning this great big giant crank, and it isn't like he says here. It isn't like dainty work. They're composing. They're just setting type onto the page so that they can print out these pages. But the pressmen, they're doing hard work. So I've been hard at work. It's time for breakfast. I've probably been working an hour and a half, 2 hours. I've got my bread and my cheese, probably just had it in my pocket, and the ale boy comes in from the ale house next door, and he's got these big jugs of ale, and he's pouring them into probably tankards. He doesn't have a nice glass like I do, but here we go. Our bread and cheese. That's a nice smooth ale. Very tasty. You don't want too much fizz in your ale, and it's probably nice and warm, so you can get that flavor. You don't want your beer too cold, and you can't taste it. Maybe I need a stronger ale because I need to work harder tomorrow or later today. You're carrying these types. He talks about the forms of types, and so there's a big box, and it's got the letters all set out, and these letters are made of lead, and it's just like a big box of lead is what it is that you're carrying up and down the stairs. This is hard work. Benjamin Franklin, he can do it, one on either side, but I probably need strong beer so I can lift up those boxes of lead. Isn't it funny that here in the 18th century, he uses the term great guzzlers of beer. That's right out of the 18th century, guzzling beer. One of the stories that really catches my mind, and I want to dig a little deeper on this, is the ale house boy. Imagine this boy that works, and he works at the tavern next door, and he spends all his day running back and forth, delivering ale to these workmen at the print house. There's more than 50 here. I don't know if that's split between the 2 floors, both the pressmen and the people that are composing, but regardless, he's delivering ale all day long. That's all he does, and he probably only does it for tips or for this, very, very small amount of money. But whoa, here comes the ale house boy. Here I'm gonna get my drink filled up. That's a story to be told. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to be part of a documentary on beer brewing here in America, and it had a historical hook into it. Very interesting. If you want to check that out, it's called Beers of Joy, and you can find it on Amazon. Journals and other books like the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin really help us understand some misconceptions that we have about the world of the 18th century. That idea that, maybe the only reason why people drank beer all the time was that the water wasn't safe. Well, this doesn't seem to point to that whatsoever. It really seems to point to the idea that they're drinking beer because they want to be drinking beer. And there are lots of things like that as we dig into different writings of the 18th century. And the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin is a great one for learning a lot about that. He's really explaining the world of the 18th century in a way that we can mostly comprehend and understand. Food inflation is something that's in the news today, and it affects everyone. It's not something new. We've had to deal with it in the past, but it's been several decades, and it's certainly a problem in the 18th century. Food inflation and food problems in the 18th century come up a couple of times. There are crop failures, specifically wheat. Bread is what feeds the populace, and if there's a problem with wheat, then a lot of people go hungry. So what do you do about that? In 1750, William Ellis writes a book called The Country Housewife's Family Companion, and in that book, he has advice for the small farmer in England. And there are lots of different parts of that book: instruction, almost recipes, and anecdotes. And there was this one particular anecdote that caught my eye, specifically in that relating to food inflation and how do you feed yourself. So the title of this little section is just a paragraph. It says, "Barley meal and turnips, boiled in times of famine. A poor woman that lived a mile from my house in a time of famine, having no victuals, made her eldest daughter follow the man that shoveled away the snow in a sort of a path for the sheep to come at the turnips. Here she pulled some up and boiled them to a mash with some barley meal, which she and her several children eat as pap with only salt, and it sustained them much." So there's a bit to this story here that here in the 21st century we may not quite understand, but the idea that someone would go out and shovel the snow away from turnips in a field. So farmers would sow barley and turnips together, they'd harvest the barley, the turnips would continue to grow, and mostly they were grown there as a green manure crop and as something to feed livestock. And what's happening here is the turnips would have a lot of greenery, but very, very small turnips underneath. They were really just meant to feed that livestock after this has been harvested. So they could kind of get two crops out of the field. And the turnips were just left in the ground. Even after the greens were eaten, they'd just sit there and rot. They would be a manure crop in the ground. But there would be turnips. There would be small, little turnips. And even the barley in this context is really a second or third tier grain. It's not necessarily used for making bread, although sometimes they would make a poor version or an inexpensive version of bread with lots of different grains, barley included. But what we see here is a poor man's crop on both sides, both the barley and the turnips. So when there was a crop failure in the wheat crop, then some of these other grains, rye, barley, buckwheat, they would become more popular just because there was not wheat available. I think we need to try out a recipe like this. It's so simple and it's so intriguing. This is what they're eating in times of famine. This is what he says is the lowest of the low food. Let's find out what it tastes like. Turnips in our book here might not mean exactly what we think about turnips. It could be that they mean the standard kind of white purple turnip that we are used to today. There are other references in the 18th century when they talk about turnips and they actually mean rutabagas. We'd even call them Swedes in our time period in Great Britain and in other places like that. In this field setting with the barley, they might even be radishes in the field. And you could see this kind of thing happening with basically any kind of root vegetable. They might even do this exact same thing with potatoes. Now, this anecdote in this 18th century book is really meant to be kind of shocking. This is people eating food that's meant for animals. They're grubbing in the ground for something where, you expect sheep to just go out and eat the grains, and that was it. That's all that was intended here. And the people are going out and harvesting kind of the leftover. And this reminds me of stories of people here in the 20th century in North America. And when food is expensive or scarce, they'd go out and they'd harvest field corn. And we grow field corn by the millions of acres here. Indiana is a great producer of field corn. And we never think of it as something that we would necessarily go out and eat. That's intended for cows or, whatever, to be processed into some kind of industrial foodstuffs. But in hard times, people would go out and harvest field corn and figure out how to eat it. Our famine food is done. He describes it as a pap, which is something like mashed potato consistency. And this is just our mashed turnips and some barley there. I put in after the fact, kind of mashed those barley or those turnips first, and then put in the barley along with water and cooked it back over again to sort of beef it back up, and then add a little bit of salt, and that's it. No butter, nothing fancy like that. If you don't have anything, you can get this just out of the field. And it's actually very good. He describes it as it sustains them much. There's, this might not be the best meal you've ever had. This is not an expensive restaurant meal, but will it feed the family? Will it keep people alive until spring? Yeah, it will. This is good. This is really good. I talk a lot about stepping out in the shoes of people 200 and 300 years ago, living life exactly like they lived it, even to the point of, tasting exactly what they tasted. And sometimes it's not a fancy meal. It's not a banquet. It's not something amazing. It's something plain. It's something simple. It's something so inexpensive that you just got it out of the field for free. This is experiencing the 18th century. This is understanding what history is really like.
Hello, welcome to 18th Century Cooking. My name is Ryan Kerr. Today we're working on a recipe that's a little bit different for the channel. It's a chicken curry right out of the 18th century, and I think it's going to be delicious. Thank you for joining me today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Sometimes when you're going through 18th century cookbooks, you want something to jump off the page and grab you, and it doesn't always happen. Whether it's because everything feels like it's a version of something that you've done before, or maybe that day you're just not in the right headspace to look for recipes. There were a couple people on the crew that offered to help. They said, hey, I could do this sometime. So I decided to take them up on it, and Caleb found this really, really neat recipe for Indian curry. We've never done that before. So I thought, okay, that's it. Let's give it a try. That's what brings us here. And it's interesting because now as a family, each individual person probably lives in close enough proximity in the US to find good Indian food, or at least Indian food. In the 18th century, they couldn't just go to a restaurant and order it. So they needed to be able to make it at home. So that's what's cool about this recipe is it's an English cookbook, and they're trying to say, I want to have something exotic. I want to experience flavor profiles that I'm not used to. And this is an English person that's taking an Indian curry recipe, putting it in her cookbook, probably putting her own spin on it. I'm not really sure. It'd be really neat to find an actual Indian curry recipe from the time period in India, but we haven't come across that. So this is the best we can do, and I think it's a really good try. This recipe comes from Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery. We've used this book a ton. If you're looking for a cookbook that gets you into 18th century cooking really easily, this is the one. Buy it. It's fun. All right, so this is to make curry the Indian way. Take 2 small chickens, skin them, and cut them as for a fricassee. Wash them clean and stew them in about a quart of water for about 5 minutes. Then strain off the liquor and put the chickens in a clean dish. Take 3 large onions, chop them small, and fry them in about 2 ounces of butter. Then put in the chicken and fry them together till they are brown. Take a 1/4 ounce of turmeric, a large spoonful of ginger and beaten pepper together, and a little salt to your palate. Strew them all the ingredients over the chicken whilst it is frying. Then pour in your liquor and let it stew about half an hour. Then put in a 1/4 pint of cream and the juice of 2 lemons and serve it up. The ginger, pepper, and turmeric must be beaten very fine. That's it. It's a pretty simple recipe. What we need to do for this is to break down this chicken. It calls for 2 whole chickens. Our chickens are larger than they were in the time period. I did get the smallest one that I could find, but it's still a sizable chicken. So we're gonna go through the steps to break this down real quick. Then we'll get it all cut up small and get cooking. I've broken down the chicken. It's ready to go. For this particular recipe, I'm not gonna worry about the wings. Put those aside. You can use them for something else. Obviously, everything that you discard is good for chicken stock. Don't waste it. Make some stock. It's delicious. Right now, I've got the breasts and the legs. So we've got white meat, we've got dark meat. I'm gonna go ahead and get the meat off of the legs, and we're gonna cut everything up small so they can go in the skillet and just turn into, well, what they call as a fricassee, but really you just want small chunks of chicken. Get the chicken all chopped up here. It's small pieces. Now what the recipe calls for is for us to put this in about a quart of water for about 5 minutes. And really what we're doing there is we're starting a broth. We're making a quick broth. We're gonna pour that off later and store it to the side until the end of the recipe. But right now we just gotta get it hot. Our chicken is in there stewing away. It's gonna be in there for about 5 minutes. In the meantime, we can go ahead and get our onions ready. So the one thing I like about this recipe is that I love food that has a lot of spices. And there are different recipes that we've done on the channel that have made me really happy. Kitchen pepper was one of them. At one time we did a recipe called pepper pot, and that was a Caribbean take that English cookbook had. If I remember right, it was English. At any rate, people are trying to experience these highly spiced foods. And I think that oftentimes when we think about 18th century, not only do we think of all the clothing being kind of brown or green, kind of earthen tones, but we also think that people were boring and that they didn't like spice and they didn't like a lot of things that they in fact did like. When we were at Mount Vernon, when we did the fried catfish recipe, there was a ton of cayenne pepper in that. People liked that. People like high spice foods, foods that just kind of reach you out and slap you before you eat them, because that's fun. And you're just like really experiencing all of these different things, and it's making your taste buds go, oh yeah, there's something happening here. All right, so we just strained the liquid off of the chicken. It's staying in the bowl back there, and that's gonna be used later in the recipe. Right now, we need to get some butter and onions in this pan, start frying it up. Then we'll add the chicken and the spices. It's gonna be great. So what's interesting here is that I wouldn't think that just 5 minutes of that chicken in the water would create such a rich looking broth already. But this is, you can already see the oils in here. You can see it working. And then we're gonna put this back in later so it gets to stew in that for another half hour. So we're creating quite a complex broth that we're gonna add heavy cream and spices to. So this thing should be full of flavor. I'm really excited about it. I was really surprised when I added all those spices in there and started stirring and that color popped. That turmeric and ginger just turned everything like a yellowish, orangish kind of thing. Looks a lot like curry that I know today. So I'm really excited about this. I think it's gonna work out really well. The room is just filling with the aromatics of all that. It smells so good in here. Then I poured in the broth. That's gonna stew for about a half hour. Then we'll get the cream and the lemon juice in there and it'll be ready to go. In the meantime, we're gonna make some rice. The rice recipe that followed this recipe in the cookbook was just basically cook some rice. Once we get the rice finished, we'll get that in the bottom of a bowl. The curry is gonna go right on top of this and I cannot wait to try it. This smells incredible. We got the rice finished up. We've got a little bit of rice in here on the bottom and the curry on top. All of the aromatic notes are really, really great. I hope that it tastes as good as it smells. That's good. That's really good. And I was afraid that the chicken was going to overcook, but it's super tender. It's really, really good. Sometimes when they do this scenario where some meat is twice cooked, then it can get tough. But this is perfect. It's stewed in there a long time. Tastes really good. The ginger isn't popping out nearly as much as I thought that it would. We could add a little bit more, give it a little bit more kick. I put plenty of black pepper in there. The lemon is what gets you. And that, along with the cream, is kind of unfamiliar. Usually, you think cream and you think heavy, but this doesn't eat super heavy. The lemon aromatics come through right away. And I don't know, it's just there's something comforting about it. It's really good. So growing up in the Midwest, a lot of times when I think about Indian food and people around me think about Indian food, they automatically think spicy. This is not spicy. It's just very full. And the ginger doesn't give you a hot note. But it's there. I can't pick out the turmeric, but I think that the spices are just coming together in a way that they're making a blend all of their own. And the way that we mixed it together, it's kind of like when you make a rub. So all these things just come together and they cook together for a long time. So it's really full. There's not a boring bite. It's not like I'm looking for, oh, I want a piece of chicken or I need to get a certain amount of rice. Just every spoonful a very consistent, nice flavor to it. If you're making this at home, do not skip the lemon. That is the treat. That is what's really great here. We made this, I was trying to prepare for this episode, so I actually made this for my family last night, and everybody really liked it. We have curry, I don't know, we probably make curry once every few weeks at our house, and this is the recipe that they want to switch to. It's really, really good. I don't know what to say about its accuracy to Indian cooking in the time period. Like I said, this recipe is coming from an English cookbook. So they're playing with those flavors, but I can't say that this is exactly the recipe that folks in India would be making. If you know anything about that in the comments section, make sure to weigh in on that. We're all working together here to educate ourselves, to learn more about history. If you've got something to say about that, I really encourage you, don't hold your comments back. Get them in there. But this, as far as curry that I know, this is on point. This tastes like curry. And I've never had one that had that citrus aromatic thing going on as much as this, which is really nice.
So it's almost St. Patrick's Day, and I wanted to find a specific Irish dish that was 18th century. This is a good one, Colcannon. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So most of the cookbooks we look into are English cookbooks. That's most of what's being printed in our time period. There are some French cookbooks, of course, German cookbooks. I have never run into an Irish cookbook from this time period. So if we want to find out what the recipes were or what they were like, we have to read into other things. So here's a reference from the Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue. This is 1785, and it says, Colcannon, potatoes, cabbage pounded together in a mortar and stewed with butter. It's an Irish dish. So we have a definition here. This is definitely Irish, and then it's sort of a description that's simplified. Now, the Irish in the time period weren't known for their complex cooking, right? So most of the dishes that are being mentioned are for the lower class, and Colcannon is like that. This doesn't have any meat in it. It doesn't have anything complicated in it. It's just potatoes and greens and butter. That's it. And, we have this kind of reference here. It's an Irish dish. Sort of what they're really saying is this is a simple dish. This is an inexpensive dish. We can find a recipe. This is early 19th century from the Cook's Complete Guide. It says, Colcannon, boil potatoes and greens or spinach separately. Mash the potatoes, squeeze the greens dry, chop them quite fine, and mix them with the potatoes with a little butter, pepper, and salt. Very, very simple recipe. So what we need to do is get these potatoes ready for boiling. Our potatoes are boiled and mashed up. Greens, the recipe calls for greens or spinach. I decided to use kale in this. Kale holds itself together really well. It's got a great green color, and it's going to give us some texture. It won't just turn into mush. So we have kale here. We just parboiled it, just boiled it really quickly, drained it off, chopped it fine as the recipe called for. And now we've got salt and pepper and butter. We're ready to put this together. Here is our Colcannon, and tell you what, it smells really good. It's got this great look with the green and the white. I love it. Before I taste it, let me read to you this one little song by Dibdin in the early 19th century. It says, this is the very end of the song, "The Colcannon went forward, the pipes and the whiskey, and we danced till the bridesmaids were weary. And now, my dear Jewel, to Mrs. O'Frisky is transmogrified Mrs. O'Leary." So there's the song. I love that reference. Let's find out what this Colcannon tastes like. Very, very good. It's like probably the best mashed potatoes you ever had, and these wonderful greens in there add just a little texture. I'm not getting a whole bunch of flavor from the kale, but well, it's really, really good. Mashed potatoes all by themselves, it's not something you eat as a dish, right? You always put something else with it. You want meat with it, you want maybe gravy on top of it. This doesn't need it. All by itself, this stands alone as a dish, and it's so very good. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. I have a special guest and friend here at the homestead today, Michael Dragoo. He's going to be cooking, what are we cooking?
We're going to barbecue a shote.
That is going to be great. Thanks for joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Michael, I am not familiar with this particular recipe. What is a shote?
Oh, a shote in some of the southern states, and still called to this day, is a young hog. And this recipe calls for a front quarter of the hog. We're just going to do a pork loin. We're going to use a pork loin just to make it something that everybody can do.
So we're doing a barbecue. What's the time period this recipe's from?
It's Mary Randolph's 1824. But by this time, you know, we've heard for 200 years people use the word barbecue, but not really give us a recipe. They just describe what they've seen. This is a very sophisticated recipe. We're going to insert a meat concoction into the loin every so inches, and then we're going to bake it.
Very good. Can you read to us the original recipe?
Oh, sure. Take a 4/4, make several incisions between the ribs, and stuff it with rich forcemeat. Put it in a pan with a pint of water, 2 cloves of garlic, pepper, salt, 2 gills of red wine, and 2 of mushroom ketchup. Bake it, thicken the gravy with butter and brown flour. It must be jointed and the ribs cut across before it's cooked, or it cannot be carved well. Lay it in a dish with the ribs uppermost. If it be not sufficiently brown, add a little burnt sugar to the gravy, garnish with meatballs.
This is an interesting recipe, but it's not super easy for us to interpret in a modern way.
Right.
So how do we get started on this one?
Well, I think you've already done you've produced a video on forcemeat.
Right.
Forcing in this time period meant to take the meat and have an end result looking different than it originally started. Mm-hmm. So we call them meatballs today. Forcemeat balls is what they called it then. And a rich forcemeat could be anything. It could be veal, pork, beef, any combination of those things. I generally don't see fowl in those. And in this case, I had some sausage in the fridge. I had some beef I minced up, carrot, celery, onion, mushrooms, mushroom ketchup, a little butter, bacon grease, and that's pretty much what's in this, and some red wine. That's almost
So ground
Generally
meat, maybe even pulverized and spiced.
Right,
So it's
right.
ready to cook.
It's a heavily spiced almost. It's basically what this is going to do is infuse its flavors into the pork loin. And because there's so much animal fat, and we've got a nice sauce that we're going to continue to baste it with, it's going to turn out quite nice.
Okay.
Another thing they mention is browned flour. They use that in the gravy. You can do that at home just by taking regular white flour, putting it in a pan, having it on a low heat, and just moving that flour around so it doesn't burn. The darker it gets, the more nutty and rich the flavor. And they're using that in their browning sauce, in their gravy. So, alrighty, we're gonna make the marinade first. And it's pretty simple. We've got a couple of cups of water. And we've got a cup of wine. And we're using some garlic. And some salt and pepper. So all that's left to do is just stir it a little bit to incorporate those ingredients, get our salt broken down. Oh, I'm starting to smell it already.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
smell it?
you can already smell the wine and the garlic. That's going to heat up and just. It's
When
gonna
that
be
mixes
great.
with the pork fats, it's
Yeah, it's
a
really
wonderful thing. So I think we're ready to start our pork.
Okay.
All we're going to do is in size, I do it 90 degrees to each other, 3 times across, and then just go all the way down.
Right.
And
So-
then once you've done that, I'm going to insert the force meat into the pork. So we've finished inserting the force meat into the pork, and I've put it into the basting sauce now, and I'm just gonna lightly cover it.
This is really interesting to watch this with force meat. A lot of times you'll see this same thing being done as larding, where if we have a real lean piece of meat and we want to get those fats in there, so we would cut slots like that and put bacon in those slots to infuse that bacon fat in there, the flavor, and make it a lot more tender. This is doing the same thing.
There's still time.
Yeah.
I think we have some bacon.
Put some bacon in there.
So all that's left to do is to get this on the coals, put a cover over it, and check it and rebaste every 20 minutes. Your pork loin, if you were at home using your oven, they recommend 20 to 25 minutes per pound. This is approximately 3 pounds. We're gonna let this go an hour and see what happens. You're striving for an internal temperature of 145, just to make sure it's safe. So that's what's next.
Yeah, and on our campfire, we're looking for coals. We don't want it to get too hot.
No, in the oven, you've got the heat all the way around it. It's nice, but in this, we just gotta keep moving it around and checking, so.
Here we have it, a barbecue from 1824. And it's not exactly what we would consider a barbecue as, a barbecue today.
Nope.
We're gonna find out what this is like.
Yep. I'm ready.
Okay.
Going in.
Here you go.
going in.
Now he just slathered this thing in like gravy.
Yeah, it can't, pork by itself with a lot of fat added isn't good enough. We've got to add the gravy.
And you could see those strips of the force meat inside of that. Oh,
That's an
boy.
intense little punch.
You want the stuff with the force meat. And I really want to try this with the bacon in there too. I mean, that's just me, right?
Yeah.
But super good.
Yep.
You know, sometimes pork cooked this rapidly can be a little tough. This is not tough. That force meat or what else, you know, if you put bacon in there, it's really going to help keep this tender.
Yeah.
And the flavors are really wonderful. You used a good gravy right here.
Yeah, you had I think you had a video on making a good gravy.
Right.
Once again, it's like the force meat. You kind of use what you have,
Right.
and it's a little over the top, intense flavor-wise because it's normally perking up a boring dish. So.
Or even a cullis. So Ryan did a cullis recipe or a whole episode on cullises.
Okay.
That would be another type of sauce that you would put on this.
Yeah.
This one turned out really good.
Yep.
It's cooked all the way through. How long does this normally take?
Over the fire, it was a little over an hour. At home, it's 20 to 25 minutes a pound. This is a 3-pounder, so it would take an hour. What I do at home, if it's in the oven, is I take the lid off the roasting pan and let it go for another 10 or so minutes just to brown the top.
Right.
So,
right. And this looked beautiful
Yeah, this was
as
wonderful.
well as tasting wonderful.
yeah. Well, when we were done here, we took it over to the earthen oven and let it brown, doing the same thing, the same effect. It's
Exactly.
really good. It's really good.
What a wonderful recipe. It is from Michael's new cookbook that he's working on, out very soon. You'll be able to find it on our website. Tell us a little bit about the cookbook.
Oh, sure. And digging up your ancestry is quite in vogue these days. I've coupled that with what foods they could have consumed, no matter where they're from. And you go back as far as you can with your ancestors, and you find the foods that they could have consumed, the recipes, get your family together, make the recipes, and pay honor to those relatives.
Right. And you've concentrated on 18th century, early 19th century?
My lineage is France to England to the colonies, and or American colonies, and so it's the late 1600s to very early 1800s.
Yeah, I'm really excited about how that cookbook's going to turn out. We've been watching that process, helping Michael out with it. Lots of pictures, lots of beautiful pictures, and some amazing recipes.
Yeah.
So that's going to be great. I'm excited about that one.
Thank you.
Can't wait to see it. Thank you, Michael, for
Well,
bringing
sure.
this wonderful tasting,
My
just
pleasure.
excellent recipe. Thank you for coming along today. Thanks for watching as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Let the eggs be boiled 5 minutes, then peel. Wipe them dry, cut them in halves, dip them in batter, and fry them of a light brown color. Serve them up with stewed spinach under, with a strong cullis and the essence of ham mixed with it. It sounds complicated. We're going to do it anyway. Thanks for joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. We're joined today by our great friend Michael Dragoo. Welcome to the kitchen, Michael.
Thank you very much.
He's brought us, I don't know how, like 3 recipes we're going to glue together or something. I don't know what are we
We're gonna
cooking?
try to glue them together. It's hard eggs fried. When you didn't think a hard-boiled egg could be any worse for you, we're about to make it so.
I can't wait. I think it's going to be good. This episode is brought to you by Michael Dragoo's new cookbook, Colonial Comfort Foods. You'll be able to find it September 16th on our website. We'll make sure to put a link down in the description section. Michael, tell us a little bit about your new cookbook.
Sure, it's combining my heritage, my past, with the foods those folks ate on those different locations. In my case, French, English colonies. I encourage you to do the same. That's what this book does. Mine are suggestions. It's about 75 recipes, but no matter where you're from, you can do the same thing.
Both recipes that we're doing today you will find in this cookbook along with many, many others, so make sure to check out that link. So I read the first recipe, but this is a combination of a couple of different recipes.
Yes.
So what's the second recipe and how do they go together?
It's a batter for frying. It's a 200-year-old beer batter recipe.
Okay.
And we need to make that batter to be able to fry the hard-boiled eggs in it.
Okay, so how do we get started with it?
I'm going to read you the recipe. It's pretty simple. Take 4 ounces of best flour sifted, a little salt and pepper, 3 eggs, and a gill of beer. Beat them together with a wooden spoon or a whisk for 10 minutes. Let it be of good thickness to adhere to the different articles.
So you come together with 2 different recipes. If we just use the first one, how would we do it?
Well, it suggested batter, for frying, and there were lots of choices, and there could have been bland ones. I picked one that had a couple more ingredients, beer, I stopped as soon as I saw beer, salt and pepper and flour, that's it.
Right, so this just perks it up a little bit.
It perks it up, it's wonderful.
Let's get started.
Okay, our first step is just getting the spinach ready. I've already washed it, I've picked the stems off. I'm going to introduce it into boiling water. I've added some salt and a little beef broth. They call it cullis, and I made some cullis and used it, but if you have beef broth, that will work as well. We're just going to give that spinach a little extra oomph. I stirred it up until it was just wilted. I strained it, and then I took it off right away and got it cool because I didn't want it to keep cooking. I didn't want it to be slimy. I didn't want it to be raw. I just wanted it to be freshly stewed. Okay, we've got our eggs cut. We're going to introduce them into the batter, and then we're going to put them in the lard. The lard is heating as we speak.
Reminds me of the Scotch eggs recipe, the first recipe
yes.
that we did together.
Way back.
Like a million years
I was younger
ago. And I think we should have
so much slimmer.
Deep fried them at the time. We didn't.
Yeah,
we
didn't.
Pan fried them, and they would have been so much better.
Nope, I have since done the deep frying much more often than the pan frying. I can't stop from getting a flat spot on the sausage when I'm turning them so.
I guess it's time to try these out, right?
Yep.
So who do you think is going to be eating something like this?
I think it's tavern fare. I think a public house, yeah.
Let's find out.
And it's a side, they had all these different sides. I have a whole section in the cookbook that is just sides to support other meals.
It's extraordinarily good. And that batter works out really good with that egg.
The beer, I taste it. You could use an ale, a hearty, something darker.
Maybe not so bitter or whatever as the. Right.
Yeah, and the salt and pepper is to taste. I'm good with this, but if you wanted more salt,
definitely.
I wouldn't go far as to put nutmeg in it, but some of us might.
I'm thinking.
Oh.
Give me that.
It wouldn't be right.
That's true.
It would not be right.
I think that's the way. That's the way to go. Let's find out.
You find out.
See, that was the missing component. You should add that into your cookbook.
You should add that into your version. I don't like spinach, but I like this spinach.
I think the spinach is just there for looks.
Yep.
It's like, well.
Except it's simmered in essence, salt and beef broth. It absorbs those tastes. So it's not, if you don't like spinach, bring it out just as soon as it's blanched and cool it immediately or stop it from cooking. But it tastes much different than and spinach. That for all, if I was blindfolded, that could be cabbage with that beef and salt taste. I don't know it's spinach. So it's well worth trying that at least.
So these two recipes came right out of Michael's new cookbook. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh, sure. I think it's important for us to connect with our past, and seeing a piece of paper with rectangles and lines on it is a way to see whom your ancestors were and where they were from. But celebrating them in a more of a 3D or tactile manner, I think is something we all could get something out of, whether you came from Ethiopia or Ecuador or China or the western steppe of Russia, it doesn't matter. You can go back in time, and however far you can go back and research and find what hapless mammals were hoofing around there and what was growing out of the ground, and find those recipes. Get your family together, and at some religious or some holiday, some birthday, some celebration, and make a couple of these dishes in honor of those relatives. Some of those folks gave everything so that someone they'd never meet, you, would have a chance to have a better life. They gave their lives many times, leaving everything they knew to be able to try for something better. So
We talk a lot here on the channel about connecting with history through food. So it's our way to connect with another culture, which is in a time period before us, right? And this is perfect. The idea that we can connect with ourselves, our culture, our own history by going back and looking at the food of our ancestors. So tremendous job. Thank you for coming along as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. We have our wonderful friend, Michael Dragoo, in here on the homestead today, cooking
toad in a hole.
This one's a little different. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So toad in the hole, that's something we've heard of today. What's toad in the hole today? What is toad in the hole in the 18th century?
Today you'd expect more often than not a nice British sausage, beef, sometimes it could be pork, surrounded by a Yorkshire pudding, something that's very light. You don't want to peek in the oven or it'll fall. In this time period, they don't have the ingredients to do that yet. So this is a much more dense batter surrounding, in this case, Richard Briggs from 1788 says a veiny piece of beef. So I'm just using a well-marbled piece of meat and cutting it in strips.
So one of the things about this one is it's got a funny name.
Yeah.
So why do you think it's called toad in a hole?
I think the beef is poking out of the batter.
Right. Okay.
It just we're going to surround that beef halfway or a little more with the batter, and as it cooks, it kind of
Right. So you would probably think of it as, you know, if a toad or a frog is in water, maybe a toad is in a hole in the ground, and you can just see the top part of him. So yeah, we've got this batter surrounding it, and then a little bit of the meat sticking out.
It's a stretch, but yes, I have nothing. I can give up nothing.
What
better,
else could they? What else could it be?
They had more time on their hands.
So this is from the English Art of Cookery, Richard Briggs, 1788. Mix a pound of flour with a pint and a half of milk and 4 eggs into a batter. Put in a little salt, beaten ginger, a little grated nutmeg, of course. Put it into a deep dish that you intend to send it to the table in. Take a veiny piece of meat, sprinkle it with salt, put it into the batter, bake it 2 hours, that's quite a while, and send it up hot. And again, that whole idea here, putting it into a dish that you intend to send to the table. You want this to be a completed dish so that you can see that batter and that little bit of meat that's sticking up out of it. You couldn't cut it up and serve it because that would mess up the look.
Well, and that's why I've reduced this one chunk of meat into servings. Right. And I've found that at 375 for about an hour. I check it at 45 minutes. Sometimes it's done and sometimes it's not. But between 45 minutes and an hour at 375, that dish is finished when I've reduced the size of the pieces of meat. Okay, if you wait for that meat to get done, that batter is burnt. This batter is really nothing more than 1 3/4 cups of flour, 4 eggs, a cup of milk, some salt, and some ginger and some nutmeg, and that's it. There's nothing making this rise.
similar kind of batter that you would use for waffles or pancakes, any of those sorts of things. Just a really, really simple batter.
This is pretty much like what I've used in my presses.
Yeah.
Very thin. And the pancakes of the time were very thin.
Right.
Once our batter's done, we're just going to prepare our meat, and I've cut it into inch square by maybe 5-inch long pieces. We just simply salt it, place it in the pie plate, and then pour the batter around it.
So this is ready to go in the oven.
Yep.
Now, in a modern oven, what will they cook this at?
375. I give myself 45 minutes and then I check it. Right. Sometimes, depending on how thick I've cut the meat or how much batter I have, it takes a little longer. But at 45 minutes, I use a toothpick and just see if it's clean or not.
So you put it into the batter part
yes,
to see if the
yes,
batter is
yep,
done, right?
Yeah, the meat will be done in about a half an hour, 45 minutes.
Right.
It's really good. It's different, it's fun.
We're not going to be baking this in a modern oven. We're going to be using our earthen oven. So how do you want to go about that with this?
Well, I think we're just going to put it in every 10 minutes. I'm going to turn it a little bit, make sure I have even heating. We've got a indirect heat. We didn't pull all the fire source out, so it's being used more like a pizza oven. If we had taken all the coals out, we could put it right in there and close the door and go visit it in about half an hour. But in this case, I just want to keep working it.
There's a lot of different ways you can use one of these earthen ovens, and leaving the fire in it is one of the ways you can use it, and we're going to experiment with that.
Yeah.
This will be fun. So this baked up in the oven, right in the mouth of the oven, and wow, that oven was hot. So it didn't really take very long to cook out. And the texture of the dough part, the batter part, is very, I mean, it looks like cheesecake almost, or a super thick pancake. The meat looks like it's pretty much done. Yeah. So is it time to try this out?
Let's try it out.
Okay. Let's see here. So
the meat is a success.
Yeah, and the batter actually turned out really good. You complained earlier that the batter wasn't, that great.
I haven't always had success with the batter.
But I think this turned out just right.
Yep. The meat infuses a taste into the batter as well.
Yeah. And I think that's the whole point.
Yeah.
It stretches this dish out so you get twice as much food out of, a portion of meat.
Right. Right. Well, this is a win. I'd mark this a win.
Yeah. Oh, it's really good. I mean, it had just the right amount of salt on it, which really, wow, brings out that flavor.
When I've made the batter thicker, it comes out a little more biscuity. It still doesn't have baking soda or baking powder in it, but it's a little different consistency than the thin. Both are good.
If there's another flavor in here, it's one that's missing from a lot of modern cooking, and that's just the smoke that we get from the oven using it like this. It infuses an extra, complex, woody, really interesting note to a dish like this, which,
right.
You're not going to get in a modern kitchen. So, and that's sort of a common flavor that's showing up in all that 18th century cooking. They couldn't get away from it. Yeah. I kind of, like it because you're used to eating regular food out of a regular oven, 5 days out of the week, but every once in a while you get to have something like this. Yeah. I'm very excited about this recipe because it's pulled from a cookbook that Michael's working on, a cookbook that will be offered on our website very soon. Michael, tell us about it.
Oh, sure. It's combining your ancestry with the foods they ate. Instead of just seeing a chart with boxes and lines, you're actually experiencing in a visceral manner of what your ancestors went through and what they ate. And it's paying honor to those people and homage to them. They sacrificed everything for us to be here, and it's just another way to celebrate them.
It's great to watch this cookbook take shape. Thank you, Michael, so much for bringing this recipe in.
Anytime.
And I want to thank you for coming along as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.
Let's talk about 300-year-old waffles. Did they have waffles in the 18th century? It's a question that kind of comes up. A lot of people ask about a very, very common food for today and how that reaches back into history. Waffles have an amazing history. They go back a long way, probably to the Middle Ages and even before that. But when we want to connect them up with 18th century England or 18th century North America, we have to look at the Dutch connection. So first of all, what is a waffle? We know waffles are like pancakes, sort of, at least North American pancakes. The other thing about a waffle isn't a waffle unless it's got a waffle pattern, right? Those square grids. If it doesn't have that, then it's not a waffle. Well, we can find exactly that kind of waffle in paintings, Dutch paintings from the 16th and 17th century. The golden age of painting is just amazing. We go back and look at these paintings and there they are, waffles sitting on plates. It looks like something that you would get today. Waffles do somehow go from that Dutch connection into Great Britain and North America. And we have these great connections. There's a lot of connections between the Dutch and the English in the 18th century and the 17th century, and especially North America. We have a Dutch colony. New York is a Dutch colony from the 17th century. More than likely, yeah, they had waffles in New York in the 17th century, 100 years before the Revolution. We definitely find references for waffles showing up in cookbooks. The first time we see waffles, especially spelled like we expect waffles to be spelled, an English cookery book from 1725. Now, we could find a lot of different waffle recipes. They'd probably be almost exactly like, waffles we have today. I want to go back and do the 300-year-old waffles. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna do that recipe from 1725, and we're just gonna see how these waffles turn out. So our recipe today is from Court Cookery, or The Complete English Cook by Robert Smith, 1725. And let me read to you this very simple recipe. Not like recipes today, right? So it says, waffles. Take flour, cream, sack, that's kind of wine, cooking wine, nutmeg, sugar, eggs, yeast. Of what quantity you will. Not many recipes like that today. Mix these into a batter, let them stand to rise, then add a little melted butter and bake one to try. If they burn, add more butter. Melt butter with sack, refined sugar, or orange flower water for the sauce. So how are we going to interpret this kind of recipe? We can't jump into this recipe like we would any recipe in a modern recipe book. What I would do on this is we know the ingredients, and many times these are, they don't actually call them, recipe books. These are receipts. So really it's just, some of these are just, here are the ingredients you'll need, not the amounts at all. We know we need a batter. We know that it needs to be very liquid. We have flour, cream, sack, eggs. We've got a lot of liquids here, and we just need a certain quantity of flour to bring that up to a batter mixture. And a lot of times I'll look at a more modern recipe, something from the 19th century, to get an idea about the amounts on this. Let's go over to our table and start to put together this batter. Right at the top, we have a complication. We need to mix up our liquid ingredients first, and we want this butter to be liquid. So I'm gonna put the butter in a little pan here. We've got maybe 1/8 of a pound of butter here, half a stick for most of you folks out there. And I'm gonna put some milk in here. I'm gonna use milk instead of cream because that's what I have. Probably 4 ounces or so of milk. And I'm gonna set this on our fire in a very, very gentle place. I just wanna melt this butter and get the milk warm, but not like hot because, well, we're gonna put yeast in here and we don't wanna kill it. So let's put this by the fire and get it warmed up. We've got 2 eggs. We also have some flour, about 4 ounces of flour. We just need a little bit of this cooking wine, maybe max 1 or 2 ounces here, not too much. We don't want to make it too liquidy. We also have some yeast. Now, we're going to be using a liquid yeast in our recipe, but you can use just regular quick rising yeast, put it in a little bit of water, let it start percolating, and then put it in there. You probably only need maybe a half a packet or less. Not a lot of yeast here, just a bit. This is a special recipe from the 18th century. It's high class and it's got nutmeg in it, so don't forget to put some ground nutmeg into this batter. It's probably what makes it the best. And this recipe also has a bit of sugar. I would only put in about 1 ounce or so. So we put our batter into this wonderful little cooking pot so we can set it by the fire and it'll stay safe. We're going to set this by the fire for 3 or 4 hours. Let that yeast really get going to leaven this. If you use something like a quick yeast, you won't have to wait very long at all. And if you cheated and used baking soda or baking powder, well, you don't have to wait at all. Our batter is over here working. The yeast is going to give us nice, light, and fluffy waffles, but we have to give it time. So let's talk about the equipment that we need to make waffles and what they actually looked like. Yes, we've got 17th century paintings. They're square. They have little square holes, just like our waffles do today. And we've got some good evidence for the 18th century. There's a work of fiction that was printed in 1798 in England, and one of the chapters is called A Layer of Waffles. Let me read to you this. It says, "The evening air was redolent with waffles baked in irons that had given them the square imprint which comes down through the ages as the only orthodox pattern." We also have other recipes. Here's a 1804 recipe, and it talks specifically of putting your waffle iron in the fire and getting it ready to bake. Not just a regular pan that you would do something like pancakes in, but specifically irons. And we also know, at least it's been said, that Thomas Jefferson had waffle irons imported just for him. So Thomas Jefferson must have liked waffles, and if they don't have the square holes, then it's not a waffle, right? So here we have a set of antique waffle irons, nice sized waffle iron. I don't know exactly what the time period is for this, probably 19th century, but it's rough enough that these might be 18th century waffle iron. And there's the inside of it. We can see it's got just that standard waffle design. And this waffle iron we're going to put in the fire and get it nice and hot. It's got nice long handles so that you can keep away from that heat. It even has a sort of a little holder so it won't just flop open on you when you don't want them to. And you can see this one has been used a lot. This has probably had 1 million waffles through it already, and we're gonna put some more through it today. They're here, waffles.
These guys smell so good, and here we are taking them out of the out of the irons, and they're steaming, and it just smells really good. These have to be great. We poured melted butter on them, just like all the descriptions, and then sprinkled some sugar over the top, like many of the other descriptions. Yeah, we could put maple syrup on it, but that maybe they were not quite as 18th century that way. So we're going to do it this way. Now, this is the 1725 recipe. Little bit different. Boy, are those good. These are really good. And you do definitely, and you could smell it as they cooked, that little bit of cooking wine in there brings a flavor in that you're not expecting and is so good. And the nutmeg is in there, which, hey, nutmeg is the thing. They had it right in the 18th century. They knew what they were doing. And then, of course, you smother anything in sugar and butter, and it's going to be good. These are kind of delicate. These aren't your toaster waffles that you can, slam up against a wall and there's still a waffle. These are nice and delicate, but yet those little square holes hold all that butter. That's what those square holes are for. Now we know, right? They're only there just to make sure all that stuff stays on top and doesn't just pour over the sides. I think that maple syrup would just be too much. Just what we've got here, just so very, very good. You know why? There's some recipes, undoubtedly, they did 200 and 300 years ago. We don't do today because, yuck, they're no good, right? But waffles, these have lasted. These are great. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Today we'll be making a raspberry wine that anyone can make in their very own home. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. It is berry season right now. So in the last couple of weeks, it's been mulberry season, and there's still some mulberries on the tree. Right this second, we're right in the peak of black raspberry season, at least here in Indiana. And in a few weeks, when the raspberries are gone, blackberries will be available. And then maybe even blueberries if we want something else. How can we use these into the future? How can we get something that's berry flavored, months into the future? Well, that's what today's recipe is, how we can make a raspberry wine. And we could do the same thing with other kinds of berries, depending on the seasonality of it. This recipe works really well with any kind of soft fruit. In the 18th century, folks are always thinking about how to preserve something, very, very seasonal. We have a lot of raspberries right now. Now we can pick them, we can eat them as a cobbler, or we can dry them to put in something in the future, or we can turn them into a liquid. And that's exactly what they're thinking about in these cookbooks from the 18th century and earlier. So we've got a couple of different recipes here. Raspberry wine shows up in probably almost every cookbook in some sense or other. Now, when I think a wine recipe, I'm thinking about making wine with grapes. And this is a very, very long process. So you pick the grapes at just the right time and you smash them and you let them ferment. And it takes months and months to go from here are our grapes ready to harvest to here's this bottle of finished wine. Well, that's not what this recipe is about at all. These recipes, almost all of them, are made wines. In other words, how do we get a flavored wine? We're going to take wine already that's made, and we're going to add flavor to it. We're going to preserve our raspberry flavor in this way. So here's Powell's book of cookery, which can be kind of an interesting cookbook to get into because the author sometimes, he's expecting us to know certain things. But this is a nice short recipe that gives us the complete idea about what's going on. Take ripe raspberries, bruise them with the back of a spoon, strain them, fill a bottle with the juice, stop it, but not very close. Set it by 4 or 5 days. Then pour it off from the dregs and add thereto as much Rhenish or white wine
as the juice will well color. When that done, sweeten your wine with loaf sugar, and when you're done, you may bottle it for use. I thought this was a good recipe, but I want to know exactly what's going on and if there are any pitfalls in a recipe like this. And especially a cookbook like this, you need to look at other recipes. So I went forward and backwards to look at different recipes because almost every cookbook has them. And I went to Hannah Glass's cookbook, which is the total standby. If you want to find anything in the 18th century, you look at Hannah Glass's to see what she has to say. Her recipe is very, very similar. She changes the order a little bit. She has fine raspberries. She bruises them with the back of a spoon. She puts them through a flannel bag, so she tells us exactly how she's straining them off. She puts them in a stone jar, not a bottle. And then she puts sugar in right away, and then she lets them set. So notice what's happening in all of these is that what we're doing is we're letting these raspberries ferment a little bit. We're not taking this, month-long process or whatever to get alcohol out of them, but we do want the raspberries to give us a little bit of winey flavor. We don't just take the juice right away and put it into our wine. We let them kind of create their own wine flavor, but not all the difficulty of it. She mixes the sugar with it and she lets it stand 3 days, not 4 or 5. And then she mixes it with the wine. And then she tells us here at the end, it will be fit to drink in a week. And then I love this part. Brandy made thus is a very fine dram and a much better way than steeping the raspberries. So she says, not only can you do this with a wine, but you can make a raspberry brandy or a raspberry flavored brandy. Now, sometimes they would do that by just tossing these raspberries in right away. But here it's like, let them ferment for 3 or 4 days. Now that was Hannah Glass, and she's that middle of the 18th century time period. But what happens if we go back 100 years? What happens in the 1670s? And that's what Digby's cookbook here is great for. And it's got a lot of drink recipes. So I said, whoa, this is, we definitely have to check out this one. And he's doing something similar, almost 100 years earlier, but it's definitely a different take. He starts off with 4 gallons of deal wine. Now, deal in the time period here is probably just means cheap, an inexpensive wine. So deal wine, you put it in an earthen jug. You put in 4 gallons of raspberries. That's a lot of raspberries. You let them stand so, infusing 7 days. And then you press it out gently, then infuse as many more raspberries. So 3 times, if you please. So it's like infuse raspberries, squeeze it out, put more raspberries in, do it again. Then add as much fine sugar as will make it pleasant. Put it into a keg, a barrel, close stopped, and let it stand till it is fine, and then put it into barrels. So this is the infusing method that Hannah Glass talked about. So don't let the raspberries kind of ferment any. You just put them into the wine and you let them set. That takes a lot of raspberries, whereas these recipes don't take nearly as many raspberries, but you let them get intense flavor by letting them ferment a little bit. Let's get started on this recipe. First question is, how many raspberries do I really need for this? These recipes all vary tremendously. So Digby's, which is just infusion, you need as many raspberries as you have wine, as much juice, maybe 3 or 4 times over. We're not going to do that. These black raspberries are very difficult to get. These are precious. That's all there is to it. So I'm not going to do that. Powell's says you need just enough of this juice to color the wine. We're going to be doing a standard bottle of wine here. So we probably don't need more than about a pint of juice. To get a pint of juice, we're going to need more than a pint of berries. So we're going to be working with maybe a quart of berries to about a quart of wine. you know, depending on the berries you're going to be using, these are black raspberries, you might need no more or less to kind of get a little bit more flavor. Maybe mulberries, you probably need a little bit more. Black raspberries, you know, you don't need as much because they are very flavorful, especially these wild ones. So I've got about a quart here. We're going to pour these into a bowl that we can mash them into. We've got about half our berries in the bowl. Our bowl isn't big enough to do them all at once. We've got our spoon. All these recipes sort of call for using a spoon, not a masher. We're not trying to grind these. We don't want to break the seeds themselves. We just want to gently mash all the little cells. You can kind of see these berries are made with all these multiple cells of raspberries. We want to break the cell wall, bring all the flavors, all the liquids out, but we don't want to break the seeds. Our berries are all mashed up. If it were me, I would let it ferment just like this, but that's not what the recipes call for. They want to strain that liquid off and leave that pulp behind. That's what we're going to do. On Townsends Plus, I did a behind the scenes video where I talked through the method here. You know, it's not explicit in some of these recipes, it is in others. I would have thought that straining it was the best way to do that, but it turns out that Hannah Glass's method of using the cloth bag or flannel bag, as she says, to get the most juice, well, that's really the best way to do it. This won't get all the juice and it'll leave some things behind that we don't want. The cloth bag really is going to be the best way to get the maximum juice out of this. We don't want to waste a bit. Let's follow Hannah Glass's recipe, and that is that we put the sugar in next. Powell's, you waited, you let it ferment, and then you put the sugar in. Here, we're going to add sugar in immediately. I think because it'll speed up the fermentation. I think. She only has it ferment 3 days, so we're gonna add in about a cup of sugar to our pint or so, maybe it's a little bit more of our juice, and I'm just gonna guess here. I mean, it is to taste, really. It's not an exact thing. If you want it sweeter, add a little more. Let's stir this to get that sugar all mixed in and hopefully mostly dissolved. Our batch is ready to ferment. We need to put it in our fermenting vessel. One recipe calls for a bottle, or Hannah Glass, a stone jar. This is going to be perfect for that. Make sure that it's very clean on the inside. We don't want bacteria or any kind of fungus to take over. We want the natural yeast to start to ferment. Our juice is ready to set aside and ferment. Now, the recipes are to put a lid on this so that it can breathe. We don't want it to pressurize. So don't put this in a jar and, cork it up tight or, tighten the jar down. We do want it to let it do its thing. Hopefully, a little bit of yeast will take over naturally on the outside of the fruit. Other things could happen. It could get mold, bacteria, fungus. If that happens, well, you should probably just throw it out. In the time period, they probably just scrape it off and keep going. But we're gonna set this aside for 3 days. Not in the refrigerator, we do want it to work. So room temperature, not hot, but 70, 75. We're gonna set this aside for 3 days. Here's a batch that I started 3 days ago. This should be ready to mix up right now.
It's got a good smell to it. It's not exactly like fresh berries, like a little bit of something is happening, which is exactly what the recipe was looking for. So it's time to add this to our wine. And the wine we're using here, the recipes call for a mountain wine, which is a white wine. And let's pick something that's a little on the sweet side. This is going to end up being a dessert wine. It already has sugar in it, so we want to start with something that's a slightly sweet white wine. Now this is supposed to age for at least a week, probably 2 weeks, a month would be even better. But we're gonna try it out right now. We wanna get an idea about where this is going, where it starts out at. So this is the start, right? It's got really, really good raspberry flavor. But I think I know what's gonna happen. Right now, it feels like two different things, like fresh raspberries and wine. But we want this to turn into raspberry wine. That's what I'm thinking. This 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, and even maybe even longer will really solidify this into raspberry wine, like proper. Like we fermented raspberries and it took months and months to make and all that. So when this is ready, we're gonna try this out in a live stream. I can't wait to taste what this really ends up being like. Can coffee kill you? That's certainly a question in the 17th and 18th century. Coffee is introduced into Europe about 1650s for Great Britain and a little bit later for France, and it starts to become very, very popular. And this is also the time when medical science, well, really starts to get more scientific, as it were. And people are starting to ask these questions about particular food things, especially new food items. Coffee, tea, and chocolate are both very popular, especially by the time we get to the early 18th century, when they are cheap enough for even everyday folks to afford. So a lot of people are drinking this, especially in the morning, and different parts of the medical, community, as it were, are looking into these ideas and saying, are there bad effects to coffee, tea, chocolate? And they're writing whole treatises, pamphlets, multiple people about the history of coffee, about the history of tea, and then how to, properly, prepare it, and then what are the effects of this? And coffee is one that has a little bit of controversy back and forth, and it's kind of fun to read these controversial pamphlets at times. Okay, nobody in the 18th century thought coffee was going to kill you, but they certainly thought it might have some bad effects. Maybe it'll stunt your growth. Maybe it'll make you impotent. It certainly isn't good for people with nervous disorders. So we certainly have multiple people pointing out some problems. Some thought that it was a waste for working class people to spend a lot of money on coffee. They should probably drink beer instead. It will be more healthy. Or, you might have somebody extreme like Benjamin Franklin. They should be drinking water instead of beer. So there are some authors that thought maybe it was too wasteful, that these working class people were, kind of wasting their money. Also, that whole idea of it'll kind of stunt your growth, right?
So there are some authors about that. But it seems like when we really dig in, that most of these medical people were very, very pro coffee. There's at least one pamphlet that talks about coffee being good for the plague. Now, I don't know about that. Other people thought it was good for, all sorts of breathing issues, that it clears the mind. So let's take a step back and think about coffee being introduced into Europe in this middle of the 17th century time period. It's coming in, and since it isn't being imported in large quantities, it's very expensive and a specialized drink. There was the whole getting started with coffee in England comes from one particular servant from the Turkish region, and he has the knowledge to prepare coffee, and he prepares it in one gentleman's house. And every time guests come over, they badger him about this drink. And it becomes, people start to come to his house so much that he's like, fine, let's open a coffee house. Let's move this out of my house because it's driving me crazy. All these people want to drink this special drink. So it can be very, very expensive in that time period. So 1650, 1660, and it takes off. Coffee houses, that whole idea of we're going to have just a house and all you're going to drink here is coffee, it becomes a thing in this late 17th century time period in England. And of course, when working class people see that and they can't quite afford that, it creates a great demand for that. And that's when, we finally get to the early 18th century. Coffee starts to be grown in other places like the West Indies, and the price comes down, and boy, it's just a great demand for this wonderful, stimulating drink. There are multiple treatises on coffee. Here's one from 1792, and he's talking about the effects of coffee. Francis Bacon says, coffee comforts the head and the heart and helps digestion. Now, this is Francis Bacon writing before coffee even gets introduced to Great Britain. So he's writing about what travelers are saying about coffee. And then we have Dr. Willis. He says, being daily drunk, it wonderfully clears and enlightens each part of the soul and disperses all the clouds of every function. And the celebrated Dr. Harvey used it often, and Voltaire lived almost upon it. He told me nothing exhilarated his spirits more than the smell of coffee. He even had it roasted in his house every morning, just so he could smell it roasting. Now it's funny, there's a bunch of different references to coffee stimulating you, keeping you from being sleepy, and yet here's this little beginning right before the directions for preparing coffees in the Secrets in Arts and Trades. Note, this coffee is much used among people of quality who prefer it to strengthen the stomach, especially when taken before going to bed. Which seems odd. Some people talk about, coffee being very stimulating, and other people talk about it helping you go to sleep. Some of the language written about coffee here, and this is early 18th century, is a little over the top, but this is fun. 'Tis allowed to be a strong anti-hypnotic, greatly dissipating sleepy vapors in the fumes of wine. So if you're a little hungover, then coffee's going to do you good things. 'Tis likewise useful to such as are afflicted with rheumatic and gouty humors. And then I love this section down here where it says, which coffee by which a right use supports the vital flame. So this author was so concerned about that coffee that you just really, really had to have it, that, it almost kept you alive, as opposed to, will it kill you? This author seemed to think you needed it to live. There are authors here that specifically point out times and places when coffee is not good for you. And here is a section, but on the other hand, he disallows the use of it to such as paralytic, and likewise such as are troubled with melancholy vapors or have hot brains. So maybe hot brains is a nervous temperament, maybe. I think we've seen that in some other writings where if you're a nervous kind of person, coffee's just going to be a little too much for you. Here's an author that's speaking to the problems with coffee and people with nervous dispositions. He says, but in thin and dry constitutions, the drinking coffee, are very hurtful, as they dry the nerves too much and are apt to make them tremble, as with palsies. And by the same means likewise they promote watching, by the bracing of the fibers too tense for that relaxation which is necessary for them to sleep. Occasionally we see the idea of impotence and sterility pop up. This may come basically from one source earlier on. Here's what this reads. Coffee then produces sterility in Persians, not because it is cold, but because it gradually dries their bodies by means of a certain sulfur. And it kind of talks about this kind of warm and cold humors. There are some medical ideas that are holdovers from the medieval era that are coming into here. So, as we get into, now that kind of sticks around all the way into the 19th century, but here they're still grasping at straws as to why coffee would have, any sort of effect. They didn't have the ability to analyze coffee and break down the why of any of this. They didn't know that caffeine was in coffee, or basically any of these things. They were just looking at the effects and kind of guessing as to the why. In this book called A Treatise of Food, he says, coffee fortifies the stomach and the brain. It promotes digestion. It allays headache. It suppresses the fumes caused by wine and other spirituous liquors. It promotes urine and opens some people's bodies. That it makes the memory and fancy more quick, and people brisk that drink it. I think it's fascinating as we dig into these treatises and pamphlets written on coffee, different scientific thought. We've got some major thinkers here working on the idea of coffee. Is it bad? Is it good? How is it good? Why is it good? And they come up with some crazy ideas here and there. It's really kind of funny to read them. And we can look back at the 18th century scientists and doctors and kind of make fun of them, but we still have that same issue today, don't we? Doctors talk about, butter's good for you, and then somebody else will come out with a different study. Butter's bad for you, and the same thing with coffee. Even to this day, some people will think coffee cures everything, and other people might think, coffee is probably bad for you. You should only maybe drink 1 cup a day. So can coffee kill you? Well, I don't think it's going to kill you. In fact, I think it smells wonderful, and the vast majority of authors in the 18th century, and probably even today, think coffee's probably good for you. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Today we're going to relax. We're going to slow down, do a nice, simple recipe. This one's called a mulberry pudding. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So this one is so incredibly simple. But it's got a good and fun twist to it. Somebody was emailing me, they were asking about mulberries because now is the mulberry time of year. They are everywhere. And mulberry trees are very, very prolific. Sometimes a little too prolific, growing in places you don't want them to, but around here I've got lots and lots of sort of wild mulberries. I didn't plant them, but they've got lots of fruit. They're loaded with mulberries right now. So why not use them? Why not use them in a recipe from the 18th century? So I went and did some digging real quick.
And mulberries show up in a lot of wine recipes. You can find any number of mulberry wine recipes, but they don't necessarily get used in cooking as much, at least mentioned in a recipe. But berries like this can be, you can use raspberries, you can use all kinds of berries. And this one is one where the author decided to really give us the hint in that. This is Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery. This is the classic cookbook from the 18th century. And here we have to make an apple pudding. Make a good puff paste. Roll it out half an inch thick. That's puff paste. Pare your apples, core them, enough to fill the crust, and tie it up close. Tie it in a cloth and boil it. If a small pudding, 2 hours. If a large one, 3 to 4 hours. When it is enough, turn it onto your dish, cut a piece of the crust out of the top, butter and sugar it to your palate, lay on the crust again, and send it off to the table hot. A pear pudding can be made the same way, and thus you may make a damson pudding or any sort of plums, apricots, cherries, or mulberries. They are very fine. So we can use anything. So this pudding is incredibly simple. We're gonna make a paste, like a pie crust, and she calls for puff paste. They use the word puff paste very liberally in the 18th century. We don't have to have it be that, 5,000 layers of butter puff paste. Some people will just buy it from the store, but it's not gonna be a ½ inch thick. We're gonna make a standard pie crust. For this one, it'll work out perfectly. And basically, we make a ball that's hollow. We toss a bunch of berries in it, boil it for 2 hours, and then pour in a whole bunch of butter and sugar. What could go wrong, right? So let's get started. Our pie crust is looking really good. I can't wait to see what it's going to turn out like, all boiled into our pudding. That's going to be a lot of fun. This episode is brought to you by Townsends Plus. It's our new streaming platform where we get to do things there where we can't do it on YouTube. So a lot of fun content over there. We have subscribers from YouTube that have gone over and are really enjoying that. So I would love it for you to click the link down in the description and check it out. Now, this pie crust is very, very simple. It's plain old pie crust. We use some flour and butter in a 1-to-3 ratio, so 3 times the weight of flour as butter. In this, we mix it up very carefully so that you don't want the butter to melt. And when we get that mixed up, kind of cut in, I just rub it in. We add a little bit of cold water to bring it all together. And this is our pie crust. Just, basically their puff paste was, let's say, a pie crust with a lot of butter. Well, same thing we've got here. I'm just gonna kind of turn this into a bowl, and I've got our cloth here that we're gonna boil it in. So I'm gonna just set it down in here while I make this so that it doesn't fall apart. Before we put our dough into our cloth, we need to make sure that it's been boiled, and then we flour it first. We don't want to tear this pudding when we take it out of the cloth. This will help it release nicely. We've got our ball here turned into a bowl in the cloth here to make it a lot easier to form up, and I've put in just enough berries so that we can close it up. And really, the amount of berries has to do with how big your bowl is, so how much flour you started with. If you want to make a big one and it takes 4 hours to boil, then you can do that. We just want to do a small one. We don't want it to boil forever. All we have to do is figure out how to get this closed up now. And we need to make sure, since it's going to be boiling water, that it closes up properly, it seals nicely, or else water will get in there and ruin our pudding. We don't want that to happen. We've got this tied up in our cloth and it is ready to cook. This is going to boil about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. Shouldn't take a super long time. This isn't a big pudding. We don't want to get really hot in here, so I'm gonna use our outdoor kitchen. We're gonna actually boil this over a campfire outside. So let me get this on to cook because I'm hungry. I wanna see what it turns out like. Pudding is now out of the boiling water. I dipped it in cool water, so that's kind of one of the tricks. It hardens that outer shell up a little bit so that when you take the cloth off, it doesn't pull it apart. This one came out perfectly, so I really floured this one well. So it came out looking really good, solid, no tears or anything. Cut that top off, put the butter in, put the sugar in. Let's take this top off and take a look at how that turned out. You can just see the berries are perfectly cooked in there. Okay, like already the saliva is running. This looks really, really good. The butter melted in here. You could probably stir it a little bit if you wanted that to sink down around in there. Obviously the berries are not gonna set up in there. This is just a wonderful little like serving device. Now she says, serve it up to the table hot. You know, put the lid on, serve it up to the table hot. So it's supposed to come up to the table like this. And then how do you serve it to the individuals? Really, really good question. I don't know. I'm guessing that, you know, when it's time to serve it, they just sort of cut it up in slices and expect to dish out a portion of the, portion of the shell and a portion of the berries. So let's just cut into this real quick. And there it is, a cut open. The outer crust is really sticking together and we can get a bite here of just some berries, a little bit of the crust. Very, very good. This reminds me of like a raspberry cobbler. So if you've ever done cobblers, you just sort of, put all the berries in there, some sugar, and then you throw on a topping. But this is all enclosed. This is like a cobbler in a ball, right? It has a great look to it, and fantastic flavor as that butter and the sugar kind of work down through the entire dish, as it were. This is really, really good. This one is so incredibly simple, wonderful tasting, and very, very few ingredients. All you need is flour and butter, a little bit of sugar, and your berries. And you can use so many different kind of components here. The original one was maybe apple, but I think it works even better with these soft berries. So you could do this with strawberries, obviously with raspberries, any kind of fruit, and you'll get this really, really tasty, wonderful 18th century dessert. I'm sure it was enjoyed many, many times 250 years ago. So just like I'm enjoying it today. I want to thank you for coming along and joining with me as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.
We are almost at the peak of fall. In this part of the country, fall is a very short season. We have a lot to finish on the homestead, and you're kind of scurrying right at this time of year to get things done. We still want to build our smokehouse, and we've started on that, but we're going to have to do a couple of other things around here as well. I wanted to come out to make sure that the oven was still in good condition and working well, because we've got a lot of people that are going to be hungry while they're working on things. So I thought this would be a great opportunity just to talk about how to use an earthen oven. And it doesn't matter for the time period if it's earthen oven or if it's stone or if it's brick, they're all going to work the same way. And the idea there is retaining heat. You're not generating heat with these ovens like you're used to in your kitchen. These are all about heat retention. And so the first thing that you have to do is get your wood in there and start up a really good fire. We built this oven 2 years ago, and it was a really exciting thing to add to the homestead at that time, but we wanted to push the idea of what we've built as an oven in the past. And we've built several. There are 3 here on the property, and then there are ovens that we've built at workshops and different things like that, that were all pretty small. We wanted to maximize on this, and we wanted an oven that we could make a whole turkey in if we wanted to. So we built the biggest oven that we've ever built, and the walls are probably twice as thick as any walls, so it's really good at retaining heat, but it does take a while to heat up. So I came out here a few hours ago just to start stoking this fire and get the oven ready to bake in today. What you want to do when you start out, like any other fire, you want a small material, and then after you get the flames going, you're just going to feed it, and you're going to ramp that oven up. And eventually the oven is even going to shoot flames out the mouth, just because you're really trying to stoke that up. So don't be worried if you're building an oven at home and you're like, I don't want to build too hot of a fire in here and break this. It's going to be really hard to do that. This oven is feeling nice and warm on the exterior. On the smaller ovens that we've built in the past, you wouldn't even be able to hold your hand up to the wall because it would be so hot. But it feels like this is about ready to go. Now, we're going to make a nice chicken pie with cream today. It's going to be a great way to use the oven, but to do that, first we have to get the coals out of the oven. Again, we're not generating heat, we're retaining all the heat that we've already put in there. To bake in it, you have to pull the coals out, and you'll use something like this. This is a rooker, and this is a nice tool that you would probably be able to make at home if you wanted to. I've made them in the past, and they're pretty easy. If you want to buy a tool to work with your earthen oven and get the coals out, this is a fire rake, and we sell them on our website. To be able to bake in this oven now, we want to take all the coals and the ashes out of there. Don't worry, we're not taking the heat out. It's already holding the heat in the walls. And the whole point of this is to ramp that heat up for a good long time so that it will stay after we remove this material. But our oven's about 850 degrees right now. It's going to stay nice and hot. We've got our coals out of the oven. Make sure that you have a bucket handy, and this is that simple. Just go ahead and rake them out. Be careful about the ones that fall on the ground. They will burn the bottom of your shoes, so watch out for that. Now you get the door on the oven, and that's going to help even out the temperature. And remember, the walls on this are so thick, it's going to act like an insulator. So there's no heat leaving this right now. It's just going to even out and get ready to bake. It's a nice chilly day out here. All the leaves are turning colors, and it makes me want something like a chicken pot pie, which I haven't found an exact recipe for in the time period, but something that's got cream, something that's rich and warm, and that's what we're going to make today. This chicken pie with cream is just going to use a basic pie crust. So all you really need is some flour, water, and butter to make that. After that, we're going to put in some seasoned chicken. I've already quartered up our chicken. It's ready to go. It calls for a chicken and quarter. You're going to rub that with lard and spice it with salt, pepper, nutmeg, and cinnamon. And then at the end, we're going to add some mushroom ketchup or mushroom juice and cream. It's going to be so good. I cannot wait to try it. This recipe comes from the Court and Country Cook, and it is originally written in 1691, then translated in around 1702. And the recipe is called a chicken pie with cream. I like that it's simple like that. As soon as the pie is made, let your chickens be put into quarters, seasoned with pepper, salt, nutmeg, cinnamon, and melted or pounded lard and fine herbs, and let it be covered with a lid of the same paste. When it is baked, Pour in some cream and let it stand a little while longer in the oven. Lastly, add some mushroom juice and serve it up hot to the table. Now, this is so simple, but that cream and that umami from the mushroom is gonna set this off. A little bit of herbs that we've had drying in the kitchen. It's gonna be delicious, but we gotta start on this paste real quick. So that's what we're gonna do. Pie crust does not have to be difficult. We'd say that on this channel all the time. Follow a 3-2-1, 3-part flour, 2-part fat, 1 part liquid. It's really easy. And you know, people talk about not overworking your pie crust, and you don't want to overwork it, but at the same time, you got to start somewhere. So don't be afraid to get your hands in the dough and just get to mixing. We got our pie crust rolled out. When you're rolling out a pie crust, don't be intimidated by its floury surface. Start from the middle, slowly work your way out. It's very easy. The bottom crust is in the pan now. We're going to go ahead and get our chicken ready to go. So the first thing that we need to do with this chicken is go ahead and get it covered in lard. All right, the temperature in our oven is nice and even now. The walls are actually hotter than they were before because that heat has just evened out and moved into the walls, and it's insulating really well. The idea with an earthen oven is that you want to get the temperature up and then let it come down slowly. In the time period, they would plan a lot of things to be baked all in one day. So if something required a hotter temperature, they would use the oven. And then they would bring it out. When it cooled down, they'd put something else in. And so you're thinking, we're gonna do a day's worth of cooking, not just heat it up for one thing. Mostly because firewood is expensive, it's laborsome, it's dangerous to cut firewood, and so they're not gonna be wasting that sort of thing. Now in this case, we don't need to mop the earthen oven. You've probably seen us do that in episodes past. With baking bread, you will wet a mop the floor because you want the moisture in the oven in that circumstance. We don't need that today. But what we do need is a trivet. Now, if we put this pie pan directly on the surface inside that oven, it's likely that it would break, and we don't want that to happen. So this will go underneath our pie pan, and we'll slide that back in the oven to bake our pie. Our pie is finished. We took it out at about 30 minutes. We added some cream into that little hole, the vent hole at the top, put the pastry back on and put it back in the oven for 10 to 15 more minutes. I wanted that to all mingle in there really well. And then the recipe calls for you to pull it out and put in mushroom juice. Now, this is a really good opportunity to use mushroom ketchup if you've purchased that or made that at home. I didn't have any mushroom ketchup today, so I thought, well, maybe we can work up something so viewers can get that taste without having bottled mushroom ketchup. So what I did was I diced up a bunch of mushrooms. I put a little bit of water in the pan with some salt and pepper, and then I just simmered that covered for about a half hour. And that gets you a nice little mushroom juice that you can put in there. It's gonna have that umami and that salty, and that's gonna mix in there with the cream. I'm excited to try this. That is really good. That is exactly what you want to eat on a cold day. That's so... The chicken flavor is wonderful. The cream brings in that fat, and it just carries everything through. It's soothing. The mushroom sauce, the juice, the ketchup, whatever you want to call it, comes through really nicely. Not a huge mushroom flavor, but it just brings that earthiness and that salt that we want in something like this. I kind of just mushed my crust and chicken and juice all together. You could probably keep it separate. Now, one thing that people are sometimes confused about with chicken pie recipes in the 18th century is that they don't call for you to debone the chicken. Well, it actually makes a lot of sense. I know that a lot of times now we don't want to go picking bones out of our pie, but in the time period, it makes a lot of sense to cook a pie with the bones in the bird still, because there's a lot more flavor that way. And so they want to get as much flavor as they possibly can in this. And so it's really not strange, but you might not have seen it before. It does taste delicious, don't worry. I was talking to John about this recipe before we filmed, and I know that mushroom ketchup is a little hard to come by right now. He wanted me to let you all know that we are working for a solution to being able to sell mushroom ketchup on the website again. Right now, it's just really, really difficult to get. Now, this recipe is a perfect fall-time recipe. I hope that it makes you comfortable. This video makes you comfortable cooking in an earthen oven. We encourage you to make one. They're not hard to make, and they're so much fun to use, and nothing tastes like something that's been baked with a wood fire. That smoke comes in. There's so much more going on than just baking it in the oven at home. That is so good. It's exactly what you want to eat on a cold... What is going on here? Go on. Go on. Hello. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. My name is Ryan Kerr, and today I have the ultimate pleasure of making an 18th century dish that's different than anything that I've seen. It's called a Nourishing Hashy, and it is going to be fantastic. Thank you for joining me as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. We're carrying a new cookbook. We haven't had it for very long, and John gave it to me to flip through it and check it out. Obviously, we already have a lot of things marked in it, and it looks fantastic. But while flipping through it, I saw a recipe that uses leftovers. And using leftovers always excites me. I have 4 children. We have lots of food. There always is lots of food left over. You know, sometimes kids don't necessarily want to eat what you put in front of them. Sometimes you make so much food because you think, I've got a lot of mouths to feed, and then it goes into the refrigerator. So anytime I find a recipe here where it's like, oh, yeah, people in the 18th century had to figure out what to do with leftovers as well, that gets me excited, and I want to try it. So this recipe comes from the closet of the eminently learned Sir Kenelme Digby. Opened. Very intriguing title. And throughout this cookbook, what I've been really impressed by, just for like with an eye of, you know, for marketing, the titles are incredible for these dishes. This one in particular is called a Nourishing Hashy. It's spelled differently than I thought, so it caught my eye right away. Take good gravy of mutton or veal, or of both, with the fat clean skimmed off. Break into it a couple of new laid eggs and stir them in it over a chafing dish of coals. In the meantime, mingle some small cut juicy hashy of rabbit, capon, or mutton with another parcel of light gravy as above, till it be pretty thin. Then put this to the other upon the fire and stir them well with a spoon, whilst the heat. When all is heated through, it will quicken all of a sudden. You may put it at first a little chipping of crusty bread, if you will. Season this with white pepper, salt, juice of orange or verjuice, of burberries, or onion, or whatever you like best. A pint of gravy, or less, 4 or 5 spoonfuls of hashy, and 2 eggs is a convenient proportion for a light supper. Wow, there's a lot to unpack here. I'm excited to dig into it. We might even, I don't know, we might experiment a little bit along the way. We'll see what happens. I'm excited. There are a couple ways to look at this. Usually when we read recipes from the 18th century and we see oranges, we assume that it's Seville oranges, which are bitter oranges. I'm not sure if that is what this is alluding to here. It says juice of orange, burberries, or onion, or what you like best. So one way of looking at this is it could be saying you can make this sweet, tart, or savory with some spice in it. It could just be giving you different options of things that would taste good. I don't really know what it's going for, but I really feel like this one is saying, make this to your palate. If you like sweet things, go that direction. If you want it tart, it can do that. And throw some onions in there if you want it to be a little spicy. You could probably even throw some garlic in there if you're doing this at home. I'm not gonna do it because it didn't call for it, but I think that's the idea that we're supposed to get from this. To get this recipe started, we need to get our gravy in the pan with a couple of eggs and then get it whisked up and over the fire. While that's working, we're gonna mingle our meat, our leftover meat here, with some good gravy into a bowl. And now I don't have any mutton. It said rabbit, chicken, or mutton. I don't have any mutton, so I just used beef because I did have some beef. And whatever leftover meat you have in this, maybe not fish, but other than that, I think it's gonna be good. Fish could be good, I don't know. Try it and let me know in the comments section. Okay, while this mixture is over here in the pot simmering, we've got a little bit of deciding to do. So, sweet, bitter, I like both. I don't think we need any extra savory in here. We've got a lot of, I mean, it's good gravy. It's very savory. And I don't think that we need anything spicy, and the onion's not gonna make it very spicy anyways. So, my take on this is I want both. So I think I'm gonna get some orange juice and some grapefruit juice, mix it up, and then put it in there. And I don't know how much juice to use. So start small. We're gonna use half an orange, half a grapefruit, put it together, give it a swish, put it in there, let it go for a little bit and taste it. And then we can always add more. You can't take it away after you put it in there. So start small. If you're trying this at home, just taste it as you go and you'll nail it. You'll get where you want. This is over here in the pot. It's working. I just put some salt and some white pepper in there. I added the juices from the grapefruit and from the orange, and I just don't think it's enough. So I want to get some more of that citrus flavor in there. So we only used half of each before, so I'm just going to go ahead and use the other half. our hashy is done. It smells delicious. It looks look like something. But what I'm excited about is that this used leftovers. And the second thing about this recipe that I'm super excited about was that it says right here, it says a pint of gravy or less. 4 or 5 spoonfuls of hashy, 2 eggs is a convenient proportion for a light supper. We don't have oftentimes people writing in a cookbook, this is the amount for a meal. And oftentimes when we're working with these recipes, we're cutting them way down because sometimes the cookbooks are made for a fine house with lots of guests. And so, your pudding would be like 5 pounds. We don't need a 5-pound pudding, so we always are halving or quartering recipes. But this one was made for one person to have a light supper, and I'm really excited to taste it. Let's give it a try. Whoa, that's interesting. So I gotta be honest, while I was cooking this, I was taking little tastes, but I didn't taste it after I put the breadcrumbs in. And what happens with the breadcrumb, the bread soaks up all the citrus. And so it's like each time you get a piece of crust, you get this little citrus bomb. And I was kind of wondering, where's all the citrus at? Like it doesn't really come through with just the broth, but with the bread, it's like, wow, this is like, I don't know. It's like a very aromatic treat inside of this pretty like complex tasting broth. This is really good. It doesn't matter what's in your bite. Whatever you spoon is delicious. And it keeps, because there's steak and there's chicken, there's this meat broth, right? And then these bombs of citrus goodness, it changes as you eat it. And so it doesn't get boring. I could see one person wanting to come back to this over and over again. Anytime they cook too much meat for one dinner, this is the follow-up. This is how nothing goes bad and everything is still tasting good. What a wonderful recipe. I'm really glad that we found this. Okay, so this recipe is a little challenging for me because of what I'm used to eating. It's almost like it's like the idea of following a steak dinner with some orange sherbet. It doesn't seem like it would work, but it really, really works. Once on a time, a monarch stirred with whooping, whipping and spurring, happy and whirring. A poor, defenseless, harmless buck, the horse and rider wet as muck, from his high consequence and wisdom stooping, entered through curiosity a cot, where sat a poor old woman and her pot. The wrinkled, bleary-eyed, good old granny, in the same cot illumined by many a cranny, had finished apple dumplings for her pot. In tempting row the naked dumplings lay, when lo, the monarch in his usual way, like lightning spoke, "What is this? What's this? What? Then taking up a dumpling in his hand, his eyes with admiration did expand, and oft did majesty the dumpling grapple. "'Tis monstrous, monstrous hard indeed," he cried. "What makes it, pray, so hard?" The dame replied, low curtsying, "Please, your majesty, the apple." "Very astonishing indeed, strange thing." Turning the dumpling round, rejoined the king, "'Tis most extraordinary than all of this. It beats Panetti's conjuring all to pieces. Strange, I should never of a dumpling dream, but goody, tell me where's the seam?" "Sir, there's no seam," quoth she. "I never knew that folks did apple dumplings so. No," cried the staring monarch with a grin. How the devil got the apple in?" On which the dame the curious scheme revealed, by which the apple lay so sly concealed, which made the Solomon of Britain start, who to the palace with full speed repaired, and queen and princesses so beauteous scared, all with the wonders of the dumpling art. There did he labor one whole week to show the wisdom of an apple dumpling maker. And lo, so deep was majesty in dough, the palace seemed the lodging of a baker. what is an apple dumpling? We come to historic recipes with a modern take, through our modern lens, and sometimes what we find is very surprising. I grew up eating apple dumplings. Anybody in the area of the country that I live in, the Midwest, grew up eating apple dumplings, and they look something like this. I had my mom make this for me for this video because her apple dumplings are my favorite apple dumplings. And growing up, it was just my favorite dessert. Every birthday, she would make me apple dumplings. When I was little, she'd put like candles in there and stuff, and it was really fun. But it's better than cake for me. It's better than anything else. Apple dumplings, that's great. So what I wanted to do is look into the historical cookbooks and see, did they have apple dumplings? What were they like? And it's kind of surprising that they don't pop up everywhere. It's not really hard to find them, but it's not nearly as popular as something like an apple pudding or an apple pie. And we have all of these different variations of what can happen within these apple desserts that basically use the same ingredients. So that's something I want to dive into a little bit later. But first, we got to talk about the recipe that we're cooking today. The recipe comes out of The Art of Cookery, made plain and easy by Hannah Glass, which is from 1765. And this is a great cookbook if you're wondering, what's the entry cookbook, or what's the first one that I should get about 18th century cooking? It covers a lot of different topics. There's a lot of different kinds of food in here, and it's really, really easy to read. So this is a great contender if you want to get that first cookbook. So to make apple dumplings, make a good puff paste. Pare some large apples, cut them in quarters, and take out the cores very nicely. Take a piece of crust and roll it around enough for one apple. If they are big, they will not look pretty. So roll the crust around each apple and make them round like a ball. With a little flour in your hand, have a pot of water boiling. Take a clean cloth, dip it in the water, and shake flour over it. Tie each dumpling by itself and put them in the water boiling, which keep boiling all the time. And if your crust is light and good, the apples not too large, half an hour will boil them. But if the apples are large, they will take an hour's boiling. When they are enough, take them up and lay them in a dish. Throw fine sugar all over them and send them to the table. Have good fresh butter melted in a cup and fine beaten sugar in a saucer. So that's the recipe. The reading sounds long and kind of complicated, but it's really not. We're going to quarter this apple after we pare it. We're basically just going to make a quick little dough, cover the apple, put it in a floured kitchen cloth, just like a boiled pudding if you've seen one of those on the channel before, and throw it in the water. It's going to be really quick, really easy. Let's get started. Our pudding is boiling over the fire. It wasn't a huge apple, but it will take some time. So we're gonna take, I don't know, about 45 minutes. And I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about apple dumplings in the time period and what's going on with them, because it's kind of hard to find a rhyme or a reason. Now, like the poem said earlier that I read at the beginning of this video, I really do think that a lot of what makes it an apple dumpling is that it doesn't have a seam. It doesn't have this area where you can see where the apple has been covered. And like when you would fold it together and it would bake, kind of like a modern apple dumpling, but it is just boiled in that bag or in that cloth, or in some cases a net. And that way, there's no seam whatsoever in the dough. Now, there are apple pies, apple pasties, apple dumplings, apple puddings, and sometimes it's kind of hard to say this is what this is, because they can be interchangeable. And we've got to remember that in the time period, we've got a lot of different cultures that are coming together here in the US. And most of these things, these cookbooks anyways, are French or they're English, but still, there are different cultures that are colliding. And you don't always know, does this culture call it this? And does this culture call it this? And the way that these cookbooks are compiled, normally they're begging and borrowing recipes from other places. So it's kind of hard to tell where everything is coming from. There are several examples of apple dumplings that are very much like the one that we've made in this episode, where there's an apple and it's either wrapped whole or it is cut into quarters or halves, cored. If it's wrapped whole, oftentimes they want you to boil it and then later cut a hole in the dough and pull out the core, which is really interesting. I don't know why you would do it in that order. Sometimes there's even a stuffing or some butter or marmalade or something like that that goes down into the hole where the core was. So all of that is basically the same thing, though. It's an apple that's wrapped in a paste and then boiled. This is another way that you can make an apple dumpling, and this one is from The Practice of Cookery by Mrs. Fraser, and that is, let me see here, 1795, so 30 years later than the one that we use today. But this apple dumpling is really interesting because it wants you to take a puff paste like we did, and it wants you to pare several apples and then cut them up, and it wants you to take a bowl, line it with the paste like we did with the sea pie episode, if you have seen that. Dump all of these apples in there and then cover it and then wrap that whole thing up in the cloth. So you're making like a giant apple dumpling that is almost like an apple pie because it's filled with all of these different cuts of apples, which is completely different, but also very similar, right? We're making like a small personal sized one of that today, and this would be one to feed a lot of people. Now, I saw an apple dumpling recipe that was really just an apple boiled pudding. And the funny thing was, it wasn't even using apples as an ingredient, it was just currants. But it was supposed to be the size of an apple, which the way that they name things sometimes can make going through these recipes very confusing. They'll oftentimes have the reference for the size of the pudding as the title. So you're like, oh, here's an apple pudding. It doesn't even have apples in it. It's just the size of an apple. What we also have going on here is just like apple desserts overall. It seems like all the dumpling recipes that I find are to be boiled. Now, if you have something that is to be baked, usually it's a pasty, or this is a really interesting recipe from The Professed Cook, and it is for apples festooned. So apples made fancy. And in this, you make your paste and you put your apples in and you cover it with another paste like a pasty, where it's making this little pie. But then you cut it out where it was something that's got a decorated edge, and then you take and you cut little leaves out of the dough and you stick those on, so it's a fancy little apple dish. And it's like probably really close to what a modern apple dumpling is, depending on if you have those baked or fried, which wherever you live, you might know them as one way or the other or both. In The Art of Cookery, which today's recipe came from, there's a recipe for an apple pudding. And in that, you're taking all of these apples, like a dozen apples, and you're paring them and you're mixing them all up with butter and you're cooking them and you're putting a little bit of eggs in there and then you're baking it. And it says at the end, you can use puff paste, but you don't have to. And I just find it really interesting that all of these dishes, sometimes it seems like the names are interchangeable and they're all using the same components, but they're going about it in a different way. And when you come into it, it doesn't seem like there's a rhyme or a reason, but I know that there's something here. And I think that the main thing to keep in mind is that in the time period, an apple dumpling didn't have a seam. It was just boiled with this dough around it. Now, that is nothing like the apple dumpling that I grew up knowing. And I'm excited to dig into this in a moment and see which one is better, or if they're even comparable. The apple dumpling that's baked, that I grew up with, and that I love, or this 18th century version of an apple dumpling that's been boiled. I like boiled puddings. I've never had one that I didn't like, so I'm really excited to find that out. Our apple dumpling is finished. It looks really good. Very different from the one that I grew up with. This has a flaky biscuit-like crust. This one has, it's like a boiled pudding type of crust where it's almost like, I don't know if it's a crust or a paste or what you would describe it as, but it's a little more dense and kind of, I don't know how you, dense and mushy at the same time in the best kind of way. So let's dive in real quick. Let's see what this tastes like. It's got plenty of sugar and butter. I'm gonna try to get the apple and the crust and the sugar all together. And it's kind of hard to cut with a horn spoon, believe it or not. That's really, really good. The apple texture is interesting. It's almost like it turned into applesauce. I mean, it's really, really cooked. It's not like what an apple pie has, and that's kind of what this has going on for it. And I'll cut it open so you can see, but you can still see individual apple pieces in this, unlike this one, where it's all just kind of like a paste. It's applesauce. It's gone. They're obliterated. And then it's mixed in with butter. This one doesn't have any extra butter. The butter's in the crust. So let's take a comparison taste real quick. Now this one feels like coming home, and it's not fair. There's no way, in my mind, this one can win, because this is like the taste of my childhood. But what I do like, it's not even about the crust, I don't think, so much as the apples. The texture is completely different. This one, there's still even a crunch to the apple pieces. This one is all applesauce, and I like them both. And if you've never had a boiled pudding that is an apple dumpling, apparently, which is kind of crazy to say, you should really try it. It's really, really good. I would be happy with either one of these. So one thing I'm wondering is, in the comment section, maybe you can let me know if you grew up with a different idea of what an apple dumpling is, or apple desserts that you liked. Because depending on where you're from, things can look a lot different. I know that in the Midwest and in the fall, even on the East Coast, there are lots of harvest festivals, and those oftentimes you have these like deep fried apple dumplings. So I didn't eat a ton of those growing up. I've had them, but this baked one, this is definitely where I come from. I set out today to answer a question. What is an apple dumpling in the 18th century? I think we narrowed it down. It is a seamless boiled apple pudding of sorts, and it's going to change a little bit depending on where people are coming from. But what I do know is that if it's got a crust and it's got apple filling, I like it. And that's really all that matters to me. Both of these are fantastic. If you haven't tried any kind of boiled pudding before, this is a really great one to start with. Hello, my name is Ryan Kerr, and welcome to 18th Century Cooking. Today, I have the pleasure of showing you how to make the confectioner's treat, brown bread ice cream. It's going to be delicious. I cannot wait to try it. And if I have done my job correctly, by the time we're done with this, you will be able to make it at home. Thank you for joining me as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Ice cream in the time period is a very strange subject because they didn't really have the science nailed down to make ice cream, but they knew they had something that was happening. And you don't see a whole lot of what we know as ice cream now, like custard, frozen custards in the time period. That doesn't come until a little bit later. This particular recipe is early 1800s, and they're still not adding eggs to make a custard. But this is a cream that is frozen, an iced cream. And it's pretty neat how it's all gonna come together with the body with some breadcrumbs. I think that you're really gonna like it. There are several different ways that you can make iced cream, or ice cream, or however you want to say it. This is a sabatier. And this, you'll notice, it looks like what is the internal part of an ice cream maker, a homemade ice cream maker, maybe a crank one or an electric one that you might use now. It has a top, and it has an open cylinder, just like what turns around inside of the ice in your bucket or in your electric maker. And so this was how ice cream was oftentimes made in the time period. You would put your mixture inside of here. You wouldn't fill it all the way up. And then you would put it into a bucket or a bowl of ice, and you would just move it back and forth. And you would create ice cream. And that works just fine. The technology hasn't really changed that much. For this particular recipe, she calls for, and I wanted to do it just because it seems really fun, just putting the bowl that you are going to be stirring it in into ice. And so you're essentially doing like what, there's probably a term for it. For me, it's like, oh, it's a double boiler, but it's cold instead of hot. Today's recipe was actually found by John, and we talked about it in a live stream and thought, that sounds like a lot of fun. We're gonna do it on the channel. It comes from A New System of Domestic Cookery by Mrs. Marie Rundell, and this is from 1806. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and tell you that cookbooks over time have definitely gotten easier to use and to read. Some of the early cookbooks will take a recipe and they'll give you it in different chunks. And they'll basically say, to make an ice cream, this is what you have to do. And it's the actual instructions of how to make the ice cream physically. And then it will give you 3 or 4 different options of these are different flavor profiles, and you'll need these ingredients for that. And that's what this recipe does. So for the brown bread ice cream, or brown bread ice is what it's called, it really just gives us 2 lines. Grate as fine as possible stale brown bread, soak a small proportion in cream, 2 or 3 hours, sweeten and ice it. That's it. So what we're gonna do is go ahead and make the brown bread and get that prepared because it needs to sit for a while anyways. And then we'll talk about how to make the actual ice cream. I've got the bread all broken up. You want it to be broken up into fine pieces. And I don't think that you have to be super picky about how small, but you want them to be fairly small. Next thing we need to do is add our cream. Now it says make sure that your cream is not too rich. So what I've decided to do here is do half heavy cream, half whole milk. And I think we're gonna get right where we wanna be. I decided to go with a whole grain wheat bread on this. The recipe calls for a brown stale bread. If you have any bread that's sitting around your house, I'm sure it'll work just fine. You just want to make sure that it's got a good texture to it. You don't want something like, I don't know, the sliced bread that you don't want a bread that if you squish it, it stays in that form. You don't want to use that bread. A lot of times if you get something from the store that's sliced and it's ready to go, you squish it into a ball and it stays in a ball. That's not what we want. We want something that's got nice structure to it. We want something that when you bounce it, it bounces back, right? And so this one here has a little bit of rye in it. This one was wheat, and it doesn't really matter. You just go for the flavor profiles that you like. I wouldn't go as far as pumpernickel bread, I don't think, because that can have a sour taste. If you want sour mixed with your sweet, you go for it. But a lot of the folks around here, I don't think would like that. And I'm not gonna eat all this by myself. I'm gonna share it with my friends when I'm off camera. Another thing worth mentioning in this recipe is that you don't want the crust from your bread, you just want the crumb. The crust is just gonna stick out, and it's gonna be this texture that doesn't make any sense, because in the end, what we want is this mixture of bread and cream. And it's kind of like we're taking something like a hot cereal and making an ice cream out of it. I'd say that's pretty close to what we're gonna have. I don't know for sure because we're not there. So let's go ahead and get our cream added, and then we'll get it cold. There's no measurements involved, so really you're just gonna pour it in on your breadcrumbs to where it looks like there's the right consistency from cream and milk to breadcrumb. Once you've added your cream to your breadcrumbs, use sugar and sweeten to taste. So here's the recipe for making the ice. Get a few pounds of ice, break it almost to powder. Throw a large handful and a half of salt amongst it. You must prepare it in a part of the house where as little of the warm air comes as you can possibly contrive. The ice and salt being in a bucket, but your cream into an ice pot and cover it. Immerse it in the ice and draw that round the pot so as to touch every possible part. In a few minutes, put a spatula or spoon in and stir it well, removing the parts of the ice round the edges to the center. If the ice cream or water being in a form, shut the bottom close and move the hole in the ice, as you cannot use a spoon to do that without danger of waste. Note, when any fluid tends toward cold, the moving it quickly accelerates the cold, and likewise, when any fluid is tending to heat, stirring it will facilitate its boiling. All right, so our ice cream is finished. I can go ahead and tell you right now, this takes longer than I thought it did. Now, some of that I think is because we had a hard time getting our bowl's got a lip on it. And so once it goes into the bucket with the ice, there was this space around the sides. And she says really clearly in the recipe that you're basically using those sides to kind of stir the cream up on it. It'll freeze in small layers and then you can stir it back in. And so because the sides weren't super cold, it slowed us down, but we got it done. Let's see what it tastes like. That is really good. I didn't know about this one. The bread is unexpected, even though it's called brown bread ice cream. The cream itself gets quite runny as it begins to melt. But the bread in there helps it feel like it's got body, which is really interesting. And I think like the sugar spreads throughout, and I think that because I don't know. There's something about that bread that feels like it brings a butter quality into it, which is really interesting. So, yeah, try it. Like this is, I don't know anybody who would hate this. Some people, it might not be their favorite thing, but they'll enjoy it. And I think there are a lot of people, if you haven't had this, that will say this is the best thing that I've had in a long, long time. This is really, really good. And it definitely has that homemade ice cream feel to it. And the whole experience, my family grew up making a lot of homemade ice cream. There's the chunks of ice and the salt and everything's kind of a mess, and you're like, is it gonna come together? Is it come together? I don't know. And then bam, it all comes together and it's awesome.
Imagine you're a baker in the 18th century and you don't have wheat available to you. In different parts of Great Britain and America, substitute grains were what people used every single day. So if we're in America, more than likely we'll be using corn. In Great Britain, depending on where you're at, if you're in the north, you're probably using something like oats and oatmeal. And in the book that we're studying today, barley is the corn or the grain of choice for the common people. So especially poor folks and middling farmers, they're going to be using lots and lots of barley. That's their substitute. Different parts of this book, it says most people ate barley bread. That's what they were eating every day. So today we'll be using barley meal. Barley's not something we use today much. Sometimes we'll use it in a soup. Pour that pearled barley in there and it kind of gives us some texture in a soup. Or we hear about barley malt being used in beer, but that's about it. That's really all the barley we interact with. But it's a fun grain to work with and an interesting one. So the description, or almost recipe that we'll be working with today, comes out of William Ellis's Country Housewife's Family Companion. And this is from 1750. And William Ellis is really writing his book to small farmers in that sort of middle, lower England area. And he writes a lot for poor people. And this one is kind of specifically geared toward that. It says to make barley meal shortcakes. Stir barley meal with water, melted fat, a little yeast, and salt. Make this mixture into pancake fashion and as large, right? Then cut into pieces like little cakes, fry them in hog's lard or other fat, and they eat extraordinary well in a poor man's family without any sauce. So some of these descriptions can be incredibly difficult to understand. And in fact, I've already interpreted this recipe one way for a behind the scenes video. And even now in front of the camera, I'm changing my mind about how I want to do this episode. Right here, right now, I want to change it because I don't think I figured it out right. It's almost like you have to read these things out loud to yourself multiple times before they make any sense. So make this mixture into pancake fashion and as large, and then cut into pieces like little cakes. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that you make them into pancakes and then cut the pancakes up and fry them in lard? Or does it mean you make the dough up, the amount of pancakes, and then you break them up into little pieces and toss them into a vat of frying lard, almost like donuts? I think these are actually donuts. That's what I think. Now, they knew about the concept of donuts, and donuts show up in the 18th century cookery, but they tend to be a very German thing or Northern European thing, not English. And this, I think, is actually a country farmer's donut. So that's what we're going to be making today. So even though I'm kind of interpreting this and changing it on the fly, it's not like we know exactly what the measurements are here. There are no measurements whatsoever. We just have our list of ingredients, which is very, very common. We've got barley meal here. Sometimes you can find in the store barley flour. What I've taken is just pearled barley is usually the easiest thing to find. You can find pearled barley and grind it up into
a meal. I just did it with a blender, you know. In the 18th century, well, they would have had their mill close by, and then they would have gotten their barley ground up there. There we go. This is probably about 12 ounces of barley meal. And the recipe calls for melted fat. Now we could use something like lard, but butter's gonna be better. I've got some butter over here that's melted. We definitely want to add salt to this. He includes that in our recipe, and that really, you know, gives it pop. Without salt, you would say, what is this? It's very, very bland. Next up on the list here is he calls for yeast. Now, when we hear about yeast, we think those little packets that come in the store. It's dry, active yeast, whatever. They got yeast from the brewer. So that's where yeast comes from, and it always comes in a liquid measure if they give us any measurements, because that yeast is what comes off the top of a brewing batch of beer, or possibly the emptins, the kind of the stuff that sinks to the bottom of your batch of beer. Now, we probably don't want to use brewer's yeast because it tends to have a lot of hops in it. It has a bitter flavor, unless it's an ale yeast maybe. So if you're brewing ale, you can use that yeast, or you can take that package of yeast, you can add water to it, a little bit of flour, and let it kind of sit and percolate a little bit, and then you'll get your nice, our substitute for 18th century yeast. The last thing that we need to think about here is the water that goes in. And I wanted to add all these liquid ingredients first, and then I would kind of know how much water to add. This is very, very thick, so we're definitely going to need some water. So we definitely want these thicker than pancake batter because they have to hold their shape a little bit. And also, once we get it into the kind of consistency we want, which is just like just slightly firm dough, right? So it just needs to hold its shape. We're gonna let this rest for a little bit. We wanna let this yeast do just a little bit of its own thing. We're not gonna let it rise like bread or anything like that. Not very long, maybe 15, 20 minutes. Most of the activation, most of the work the yeast is gonna do is in the heat of the oil. So it'll do its own thing once it's there, but we do wanna let this rest. Well, here they are. They look cute, don't they? They're not donuts, right? But maybe that's what I would call them. The recipe or the description calls them barley meal shortcakes. I would probably call them poor English farmer donuts, something like that. They definitely turn out better than my first idea, which is fry them up kind of like pancakes and then cut them and put them in. That didn't work out because they were just too thin. They didn't have any body to them. They kind of looked like chips almost in that the way they cooked up. This is so much better. We dumped them in into the hot lard. It was about 325 degrees or so. They took a little while to cook because, they're kind of dense. So maybe 5-10 minutes. But they have a really, really good texture once they are done. These have cooled off a bit, so they're a little delicate when they're hot. So you have to be careful or they might break. But now they're really nice. I did sprinkle a little bit of sugar and spice on there. So let's find out what they taste like. Texture is perfect. When they come out, you think maybe they didn't get cooked in the middle. They're cooked in the middle. Savory, just a little bit of hint of sweet on top, but very filling and really interesting texture in that this isn't flour. This is a meal. So, there's still some texture to this grain instead of it just being, pulverized into, a flour that just kind of turns into a dough. And I really like that. Maybe if you're looking for, a comparison, you might call it similar to a Hush Puppy, if you're familiar with those. It's always great fun to dig into the books, not necessarily recipe books sometimes, but books like this that are much more descriptive, or even, a journal or something, and they talk about a food and you say, how do I recreate that? How can I get there with this description that I've given? And this one was a little tricky. It took me multiple tries, and even after reading through the fourth time, it's like, wait a minute, this is something completely different. That's kind of the fun. It's food detective work. It's a mystery sometimes to get to the product that is being described, but that is what we try to do here. Stepping into the footsteps or the shoes of people in history and trying to taste and smell what they got to eat. So this is a great fun experiment. Thank you for joining me today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. I've got Ryan in the kitchen with me today, and we'll be cooking a recipe that's called To Make Pan Puddings. We're gonna have a lot of fun with this one. Thanks for joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So Ryan picked this recipe out. Why did you pick this one out, Ryan?
Well, I wanted to get into this cookbook because I hadn't used it a whole lot, and I wanted to find something that wasn't a super heavy meat dish. I wanted to find some desserts or something fun like that.
It's always kind of a challenge to find out what the next recipe is going to be, and so this is Pastry and Cookery, Mrs. Susanna MacGyver, and this is one of the recipes with a lot of Scottish twist in it. It's not necessarily just Scottish, but the measurements that she uses, some other things really say, okay, this is kind of Scottish cookery, at least getting into the English world. Now, this recipe is tricky to read. I mean, it's like this one, you have to spend a lot of time, and we can kind of fight over some of the things.
That's kind of what drew me to it. I was like, wait, what? And it took 4 or 5 times.
I'll let you read it. You want to read this one?
Yes,
you read
thank
it.
you so much. To make pan puddings, beat 4 or 5 eggs with 4 spoonfuls of flour. Cast it until the flour is free of knots. Put in a little salt and sugar to your taste. Beat cinnamon and nutmeg. Near a munchkin of sweet milk, a dram, a handful of currants, and as much sweet suet shred small. Wow. Mix all well together. Put a piece of butter in the frying pan or beef drippings. When it boils, lay as many petty pans in the frying pan as it will hold, with their bottoms upmost. Put in the pudding stuff at the bottom of the petty pans. You must fry them on a slow fire, otherwise you will burn them.
It keeps going?
Yeah, and they will be raw in the heart. When the petty pans come easily off, they are ready for turning to the other side. They eat well and are a very pretty dish.
This is so complicated, and you got to interpret this all over the place because I mean, this is not a modern recipe in any way, shape, or form. We don't have a lot of measurements here. We have some strange terms like a mutchkin and sweet milk and a dram and suet, which we're probably, not too familiar with. And this whole thing with the petty pans and being upside down, right side up. What do we do with them?
Right.
So we're gonna have to fight our way through this one. So we start off with beat 4 or 5 eggs with, are we gonna do the full recipe here? We probably don't need a full recipe.
No, I guess we don't, yeah.
Because, I mean, we'd end up with 47 of these things and we don't need that. So anyway, it starts off with beat 4 or 5 eggs with 4 spoonfuls of flour. So how much flour are you gonna use? What's a spoonful of flour?
I was going, actually, that's why I grabbed this, but I was gonna do heaping.
Yeah.
Right, because I think the goal is to have as much flour as you have egg. I think it's a 50-50.
Okay.
So that's where we're gonna start anyways.
Okay. So, yeah, so let's, and when it says cast, it means to continue to whisk. Why it doesn't say whisk, it says cast instead, I have no idea, but we're gonna whisk that until the flour is free of knots. In other words, we want it whisked until it's not lumpy, right?
And the last recipe I did from this book
Yeah.
said cast some sugar to the mixture.
Right.
So they're using cast like
Right,
it could
it's
mean
like
anything.
cast it in, cast it in. So, well, I guess let's get started.
All right.
Now we need to add our muchkin of sweet milk. Now we trimmed this recipe
Right,
down a little bit, so I would say about half of that. If you're doing a half recipe, a cup, our muchkin could be anywhere about a pint, maybe as much as 24 ounces. But we don't want to add too much liquid here. We might have to add back in some flour to bring our texture back up. We have our dram. It's just a tiny little bit of brandy you want to drop in there.
Sure.
And a handful of currants. Maybe I should put the handful in, because if you put a handful in, we would have way too many. So here's our handful of currants. So the next part here is sweet suet shred small. So sweet being not yucky, rancid, or sour.
You don't want that.
Suet is hard to come by here in America, North America. So if you can't get a hold of suet, your closest substitute is going to be frozen butter chopped small. Because what we want it to do is hold together and then melt and make a little hole in this thing. It's sort of like a leavening. We've got the suet here that we sell in the store, and we chop this down into a nice fine texture. It's ready to go into our mixture. So let's just put this in. So we tried to cut this recipe down. We still have like a half gallon of this stuff. Yeah, so the question is how this goes into those little pans. Will it run out? Will it cause us trouble? We may have to thicken it up, but we're gonna try it like this. And if it needs to have a little more flour, then that's what we'll add.
I think for a standard pudding, if we were just gonna bake this, it'd be fine.
Right.
But we gotta flip those tins upside down. So, we'll see.
Let's heat up the fire. So here's the confusing part, or one more confusing part here. It says, put the drippings in the frying pan. When it boils, I don't get this part. When it boils, lay in as many petty pans in the frying pan as it will hold, with their bottoms upmost putting the pudding stuff at the bottom of the pudding pans, right? So what's your interpretation here?
So I read this a few times and I was like, wait, how do you do this? Do they have like putting the petty pans that don't have a bottom? But really, I think what she's saying is go ahead and put them in to see how many your pan is going to hold. Once you've got an idea of what's going on, fill them up and then put them back in. But you are putting them bottom down. And once that cooks enough that it holds, you're going to flip them around and cook the other side. Now the challenges that we have here are that because these have these little ridges, they're not going to sit just so. They're not going to be perfectly flat. So that coupled with a possibly loose batter, we are going to have to do some experimenting here, but I think we're going to get it.
Okay. They're out of the pan. They're cooked. You did a great job on these.
Thank you.
I didn't know how they were going to turn out.
I didn't either.
But I mean, they were tricky getting them to flip over in the pan, but it
Yeah,
didn't.
and getting them out of the little tins was a little tricky.
Yeah.
But here they are.
We ended up buttering the tins a lot to get them to release. I mean, you could serve them up in the little tin, but it's not as nice.
No, and she talks about how this makes a very pretty dish, and this is what she's talking about.
We went ahead and sprinkled some sugar over some of these. You could do a pudding sauce, and we've done a whole episodes on pudding sauces. Pudding sauce is really good. You could just slather these in maple syrup or any other numbers of dangerous things. Let's try it out. But look at it. I mean, it looks good.
Yeah.
I'm going to tear this open here. It has that typical pudding consistency. I don't know, the suet didn't do exactly what I expected it to do. It's supposed to leave little holes in it.
Yeah. I don't know. It looks like it, I don't know, maybe it clumped up. I don't know. If we shred it fine enough. This one looks better.
Yeah, there you go. That looks good. They're tasty. So, if you don't want to boil a pudding, because these are very, very related to that idea of boiled puddings. If you don't want to boil a pudding, you don't want to take 4 hours to make this soft ball sized thing. You want to do them small in a pan, in a frying pan. These do do what you need them to do. Very good. I could eat them all day. There's maybe, I mean, you could lift these up with a little more spice, maybe a little more nutmeg.
Right. Absolutely. Yes. That's the only spice that I think could be added to make them better. Hello and welcome to 18th Century Cooking. My name is Ryan Kerr. Today we are making almond flour to make these little almond cheesecakes that just could not be any cuter. It's going to taste really good. I'm really excited about this one. Thank you for joining me as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. In the 18th century, almond is a very popular ingredient, especially in desserts, but you see, it's kind of nuts. You see a lot of pickled almonds, you see candied almonds, you see a lot of almond flour dishes, and we haven't done a ton of that on the channel, just a little bit. I was flipping through the cookbook and I saw this, and one thing that I really love is a very good almond flavor. And the problem with using like an almond extract or a fake almond flavor is that you can smell it. You can spot it from a mile away. It's not hard to get a really great natural almond taste in your desserts, and I'm going to show you how to do that today. This recipe is great for keto if you replace the sugar with something like stevia or any kind of sugar replacement. It's also a really good gluten-free dessert, so I think that you guys will really like it. Let's get into the recipe. So this recipe for almond cheesecakes comes out of Cookery and Pastry by Mrs. Susanna MacGyver. It's an interesting book. I don't think we've used it a ton on the channel. I personally haven't, but there's a lot of really neat stuff in here. To make almond cheesecakes, blanch and beat half a pound of almonds. Wet them with a little brandy while you are beating them. Cast 6 eggs, keeping out 4 of the whites, with fine sugar, and cast all together with the almonds. Season them with the grate of lemons or oranges. Put in 6 ounces of oiled fresh butter and mix all well together. Put them in the petty pans and fire them in the oven. It's that simple. The process is really good, but the thing that we have to do to get this started is we have to turn this into this. And that's what I'm going to show you right now. First, you're going to get your water on the burner and get it boiling. Once it's boiling, you're going to dump your almonds into the boiling water, and this called for a half a pound. So enough water just to make sure that they're covered. Let them boil for a minute. Take them out, and once they're out, you want to cool them down. So you're going to strain off the water, cool them down with some nice cold water to try to stop the cooking, because you don't want them to get soggy, and if they overboil, they're going to get soggy. And then now you're just pinching the skin and popping the almond out. And once you're done with this, you're ready to go. We're just going to pulverize these almonds and turn them into almond flour. It's that simple. I was talking to some friends about making this recipe, and they were just kind of like, oh wow, you're going to blanch almonds and make almond paste? And I was like, well, essentially, look at that. And they were kind of like, oh wow, that sounds difficult. And it's not difficult at all, but I think it is one of those things that people haven't done, so they're kind of nervous about doing. And I want to go ahead and tell you right now, there's nothing difficult about this. So I finished the blanch on these almonds, gave them their cool water bath, and removed the skin. Then I just gave them a nice chop to make them break up a little bit. And now it's just time to wet them with a little brandy and pulverize the heck out of them. I'm going to be at this for a while. If you're making this at home and you're not trying to strictly go 18th century on this, a food processor is going to come in really handy for you right now. If you do go that route, you're going to want to make sure to put a little bit of powdered sugar in with them as you pulverize them, and that's going to help it from turning into almond butter. And don't go too far. You don't want to over process. All right, I've got my almonds pulverized now, and let me tell you, if you are going to do this by mashing and chopping, it's a rotation. You're gonna chop, you're gonna mash, you're gonna get frustrated because your mashing's not going as quickly as you want it to, then you'll chop some more. I added some sugar along the way because I got a little brandy heavy, so I wanted to soak up some of that brandy. But it's a nice consistency right now, and it's almost like a paste. I think you can you can even ball it if you want to. So now we're at the point in this recipe where we're going to add our wet ingredients and our sugar. So we've got our 2 whole eggs in there, and now it calls for 4 egg yolks casting off the whites. If you haven't done that before, it's really easy. You just crack your egg, and then you've got 2 shell halves, and you're going to alternate the yolk in between the shell halves, just like this, while you discard the whites, and then it's just the yolk and you dump it in. We've got our eggs incorporated here. Now it's time to add a little bit of sugar, and like I said, I added sugar as I was mashing up the almonds, but it still needs some more. I'm using powdered sugar. It says fine sugar. You could use any kind of fine sugar that you want to, but I wanted this to be really smooth, and so I decided to go with powdered sugar. I don't know what to tell you as far as the sugar goes. In my experiments, I added about 1.5 cups of sugar. Okay, so this is looking really fantastic. I'm really excited about this mixture. I think it's got a good consistency. My take on the lemon zest is not to go too heavy-handed with it. After all, this is an almond cheesecake, not a lemon cheesecake. There are plenty of recipes for lemon cheesecakes. I want the almonds to be the star of the show here. Now, it calls for fresh oiled butter, and that is ghee. That's what they're talking about. So I've got 6 ounces of ghee here. That's going to go in right now. And that is gonna make this really rich. So I think that the finished product here is gonna have some crazy complex flavors. You're gonna have the aromatic of the lemon zest, and the sugar's gonna come through and bump that almond up. And then you're gonna have this richness and this body to go along with it. So I think it's shaping up to be quite a dish. I really don't know how long these are gonna bake for because they're such small vessels. I'm gonna play with it. So once I get them back, I will let you know what worked. But as of right now, just keep an eye on your oven, and I'm gonna do the same, and we'll see what happens. We have beautiful cheesecakes out of the oven. The best thing that I can tell you about this is to bake them at 350 and keep an eye on them. You want this nice golden color right around the edge, and you just want to make sure that the center is set. You don't want to dip in there and just have a batter. And now it's kind of tricky because these are meant to have a texture that is kind of gooey. That's why all that ghee is in there and all that egg fat. But you do want it to be set up. So if you can do this to the top and your finger's not going through, you're probably good to go. But you definitely want those golden, crispy edges. If I've learned anything in my tenure at Townsends about cheesecakes in the 18th century, they are not talking about what we think of as cheesecakes. They're just going for that creamy texture. So it's not talking about using cheese, it's talking about the texture. And these, if they have the right texture, if we've done this correctly, they will have a crust all around the exterior, including the top, which it sounds like it does. And the center will be ooey gooey. And so I'm gonna try to show that best as I can. Yeah, see, that spoon just goes around, and look at that. There's a crust right on top, and then there's this buttery, ooey gooey goodness right underneath. Oh, that's good. Okay, so what's going on here is you've got that little bit of crunch, just the perfect amount of texture, and then that soft, buttery, gooey filling, which is just the batter. But it's interesting because you've got this full body egg yolk and butter fat thing going on that makes this feel substantial. And at the top, just kind of dancing around on your taste buds, you've got the combination of that sugar with almond. So it's very aromatic, and then the citrus right on top of that. It's just like, it's having a party, and it's having a good old time, and I love it. This is fantastic. All right, we have accomplished our goal. We made an 18th century recipe that packs almond flavor like a punch. It is really, really good. It sits heavy. If you're making this for a dinner party or something like that, with all of the butter and the egg yolk fat in there, one of these will be enough for anybody that comes to the party to finish off the meal. And it's sweet, it's fantastic, it's got citrus notes, everything that they could want.